Welcome. So I'm going to do the welcome and welcome all of you to the coordinating board offices. And we do have online listeners, and I welcome you as well. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started with our presentations. First one is attendees here. You all have name tags. It's very important that you wear those name tags, especially if you get out and go to the restroom. It's a security request that everyone who is a visitor has on a name tag. So make sure you wear those when you leave and come back in from lunch, etc. Bathrooms, if you need to take a bathroom break, please feel free to do that. We're going to try to take a morning break. Probably we're going to play it by ear. Probably after the second presentation, we'll take a 5 to 10 minute break so that you can run to the restroom. But if you need to go while we're going through the presentation, if you go out the way you came in, back to the main hallway, then turn right. You'll see the signs. They're on the left in the middle of the hallway. Women's is on the left and men's is on the right. So. Lunch, we will take a break for lunch. Lunch is on your own. I believe Teresa provided in your handouts a map showing the different places that are around the coordinating board where you can hopefully get to within the time allowed. We are going to try to break before noon so you can hopefully beat the lunch crowd and then get back to resume at 1. We're going to, again, we may get through a little bit earlier than we expect, and that'll just give you a little bit longer at lunch to get out and get back. Microphones, because we do have online listeners, it's really important that if you ask a question, and we do encourage you to ask questions while you're here today or make comments, whatever, there is a microphone on each of the tables in the last 3 rows here. If you have a question right here, we'll bring the lapel mic up to you. But it's really important because if you ask the question without the microphone, the online listeners will not be able to hear you. So we do request that you do that. There are copies of PowerPoints and handouts. For those online listeners, if you will go to the address, that first address right there under agendas, PowerPoints, and handouts, that's our GSP information site, and it will, if you'll go to the workshop section, you can print out or view the PowerPoints and any handouts. If the presenter had an extra handout, it will be available there as well. For those attending here, you could have made copies on your own if they were available, but we have also made copies for you so that you will have those while you're here. Email address for online listeners. If you have a question, you're out there listening to us online and you have a question that you want to ask or a comment that you would like to make, if you will send an email to fameeting@thec.state.tx.us. I'm going to be manning that so that I will see any questions coming in or comments, and I will be able to present that question for you. And again, I encourage those participating here in this room to please feel free to ask questions as we go along. We do ask that you complete an evaluation form. It should be in your packets if you're here in the room. An evaluation form is also, there's not a separate evaluation form out on the website. It's attached to the agenda, but you can complete that and then send it into FA meeting, and when we're finished at your convenience, so that we'll have that information. We have had issues in the past with streaming for online listeners. If you do have issues with streaming where my mouth is moving and the sound is like delayed, we have been told that that's probably more of an issue on your end than on our end. So I know it's annoying, but hopefully it won't be too bad today. We'll keep our fingers crossed. But in case you do, you can send me an email. I'll check and see if there's anything going on, but probably it's more of an issue on receiving the video feed on your end. We have had a few agenda item changes. As I said, I'm not Lisa, I'm Lynn Kenyon, but Lisa was unable to be with us today. Also, Connie Cooper is unable to be with us today to do the exemption and waiver session, but we will be doing the session. It's just that Jane is going to step in and do the session for her. So that's a change to the agenda. And then again, we'll kind of play it by ear as far as breaks are concerned. Any questions, or is there something that I failed to go over that you need to know about before we get started? Anything that y'all can think of that I failed to go over? Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and get started then, and I'm going to let Jane come on up to talk about program allocations and negotiated rulemaking.
Good morning. Let me get this hooked up. That okay? All right. Could you bring up the negotiated rulemaking set? Thank you. I'm going to wander around over there. I'm too far away from you. I like being closer. I've worked with the financial aid programs here at the coordinating board since before some of you were born. Been here more than 40 years. And during that process, one of the things that I've been involved in ever since we only had one program, which was TEG, the private school program, was the allocation of funds among institutions. And if you have a simple program, that can be a simple process. But as time has passed, as you might have noticed, our programs have gotten more complicated. We have different wrinkles as to who's eligible and that kind of thing. And in the past, what we have done is try to get add more layers of complexity to the allocation process to try to capture who was here at least three-quarter time, how many returning students would be there, and all that kind of thing. And eventually, we've had issues where we've made mistakes and that kind of thing. So one of the things that came out of our legislative session last time was a request, or actually it's in statute, so it was more than a request, that the coordinating board go through a negotiated rulemaking process with institutional feedback. Actually, they call it stakeholders, so institutions are the primary group, but we have a few organizations involved in it. But the idea is to get stakeholder input as to how these programs should be allocated. Does it have to be as complicated as it has become? How can we make it more transparent so institutions understand it and have a better sense of how we come up with our numbers? When you're dealing with programs like Texas Grant, where the allocation is $360 million in a year, everybody wants to know how those numbers get derived. So the negotiated rulemaking process is where we have ended up. Let me get a little more information up here. I'm on top of it. There we go. Again, the idea is to get stakeholders involved in this process. And the first step in all of this, and most of these steps are actually outlined in statute. So this is not more complicated than it has to be, but these are the steps that are required in order to do a negotiated rulemaking process. First thing is to get people recommended or nominated to serve on the negotiated rulemaking committee. Some of your peers, some of the financial aid officers are on these committees. We allocate funds in the grants and special programs area for Texas Grant, TEOG, Work Study, and TEG, the private school program. So for your group, the group today, it's Work Study and Texas Grant mainly that we're talking about with negotiated rulemaking. But the first thing is simply a call that goes out to presidents and chancellors asking them to nominate people from their institution who they think could represent their sector. One of the issues that comes up in negotiated rulemaking is it's hard not to be there just trying to defend your institution as opposed to trying to get this broad overview of what's good for the state. And that's been one of the main challenges of these groups, but they've done a really nice job with it. Once we have nominations, then that group is reviewed by a staff here at the coordinating board to assemble, someone to represent this group, that part of the state, this size of institution, try to get a really good cross sampling of the relevant stakeholders. And then that gets posted in the Texas Register so that people can make comments saying, oh, I don't think that person should be on the thing because I know blah, 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 or I have someone else I think we should recommend. And so that gets done, and then eventually we end up with the committee being named. And meetings are set up for the committee. These groups come in, and unlike this kind of a meeting where coordinating board staff just walks up and starts telling you this is what we're going to do, there are facilitators assigned that are trained in negotiating process, that are assigned to conduct the meetings. They are not subject matter people. They don't know a Texas grant from Be On Time loan. They are there to make sure that the process is unbiased, open discussions, and all of that kind of thing. One of the first things they do is get the group to identify what they consider consensus so that they will know what it takes in order to get a set of rules that they design passed. Now that sounds like a simple thing, but if you end up, for instance, with 100% having to be in agreement in order to have consensus, what that means is one person could keep that rule from going forward. So it's a really interesting process. Okay, we finally get the group set up. They agree with the facilitator or to having this person as a facilitator. Ground rules are run, and we start looking at the rule as it currently exists. Now, most of our programs have rules about allocations, but it would say something like, funds will be allocated in a way that's so that institutions get their fair share of the funds. And no detail in there at all. What these committees are doing is actually coming up with the formula that will be used for allocating funds in these programs. It's a very detailed thing. And then once they come up with their new rules, those are posted again in the Texas Register for comment. Anyone looking at it can say, this won't work, this doesn't look like a good idea, or this is a great idea, we're happy with it. And eventually it goes to our board for adoption. And it's only after it's gone through the board and has been adopted that the negotiated rule goes into effect. Now we started this process, welcome. We started this process last fall. And we now have one program that is still in the negotiating process. It had a meeting actually yesterday, and that's the two-year college's TEOG program. The Texas Grant, Work Study, Be On Time, and TEG rules all have rules that have been adopted. Now the timing on the adoption has an impact as to when they go into effect. Texas Grant didn't get agreed upon in time for it to impact the allocations for next year. So the new rules of the negotiated rules for Texas Grant will start being applied for 2016. So this coming year was done under the old methodology. The new methodology will start next spring for the following year. Work study was done fairly quickly. It was in effect for the allocations for 2015. So that was the new formula. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, that's me. Boy, the help you get. All right. So this is our status with the negotiated rulemaking. For Texas Work Study, final rules were adopted. They were used in doing the allocations that you have received for 2015. Texas Grants, they have been adopted. Well, excuse me, they have been proposed. They are currently posted in the Texas Register for comment. On the 22nd of June, that comment period will end, and then they will go to the board for final adoption in the July board meeting. But again, because of the timing and needing to do the allocations for next year sooner, that new formula will not go into effect until the allocations for 2016. TEOG, we're still sitting around the table negotiating. Top 10, we don't do allocations in top 10, so this whole process did not apply to them. And then the Be On Time program for the independent students, that was done and was done in time that it will impact the allocations for 2015. Okay, what did we do? What did they come up with? We don't need to get into all the way down into the weeds on these things, but it's good for you to understand the level of detail that they got involved in. For the work study program, they're going to use prior financial aid database information. So it's certified data. One of the pit holes that we fell into trying to do the allocations in the past is trying to use the most current information possible. The problem with that is that if you're trying to use current year numbers of recipients and so forth, it's changing every day. So you set up your worksheets, you put in the information as of now, and 2 weeks later we have new information coming in. Or we may do the reallocation and now we have different numbers again. So one of the decisions for all of the groups was to move back and use prior year data. Now that will make it a lot easier for us to be working with certified data that isn't changing and be able to get this information and the allocations done sooner. We'll talk about timing in a minute. One of the parts of the work study is that it relies on 9-month EFC cutoffs. Now, one of the things we learned in this whole process as we were doing the research connected to the negotiated rulemaking is that in the FADS report, where you report an EFC, the instructions are to report the EFC for the period of enrollment for which the student is getting a grant or whatever. So it could be 12 months, it could be 4 months, it could be, so the EFCs that are in the FADS report aren't necessarily what this is calling for. So one of the changes to the FADS report for this fall is there will be a new column that asks strictly for 9-month EFCs. We hope everybody has those, even if you're not using them in your packaging, and that you will be able to plug it into into your FADS report. If you don't, we're going to have bad data as a basis for allocating in the following year. So it's going to be really, really important. If you talk to your reporting officers, make sure they are aware that the FADS report this fall, is going to have an extra field for the 9-month EFC, and it'll be very, very important for them to fill that out. Another thing that they implemented for work study that we have never had before is an EFC cap that is in this case, it's the 9-month cost of attendance for a community college for community college, student enrolled for 30 hours living off campus as reported by the college student budgets. That sets a cap somewhere in the 14,000 range. So the vast majority of students are going to fall into that category and be counted. It does keep the more wealthy people who might be in the database out of the system. So this formula was used this year. One of the other changes that came from the negotiated process is the desire to have it as transparent as possible, to let you guys understand where we're coming from. And so when the work study allocations for next year were calculated, all of you got a notice saying this is how much you're going to get, and this is how we got there. Please review these calculations. So you were given for the first time in any of these programs a chance to review our math work. And primarily to check that the data that you had sent to us that we used in the calculations was accurately reflected in those calculations, that we didn't distort it, that we didn't take one institution's data and plug it into your institution. So that is going to be that has turned out to be a characteristic of all of the rules that have been passed, is that institutions will not just simply get a notice, this is how much money you're going to get. The first time that goes out, it's going to be, this is our current draft of what your amount will be. Take a look at the calculation, make sure that we have quoted your data accurately, and then let us know if there are any problems. That gives us a chance to get your feedback, and if we have made a mistake, make a correction before any of the numbers get final. So we feel that's a really, really good step. Notice you're not proofing whether our methodology is what you like, but you are proofing whether we are accurately quoting your data, which is very, very important. Okay, in the Texas Grant Program, we have that silly thing of a renewal and initial. And the program gives priority to renewal students, so the first step was to figure out how to allocate money for renewal students. Priority is given to renewal students in Texas Grant. So what was decided upon, again, we're using prior year data or prior year data because we're trying to get to where it's data that's certified and not changing. And basically what you're going to get as a renewal allocation in Texas Grant will be based on prior 3 years data on your numbers of renewal and initial students. Nice thing about 3 years is that if you have one bad year, the other 2 will keep you going. If you have one extraordinary year, it will help everybody else because it's going to be mellowed out and everyone will have more consistency in what they will be getting. So renewal is based on the data you have reported to us through the end of year report, because that's where we have initial and renewal identified. So that gets us the renewal section. Then we figure out how much money all of that will require, and the money that's left over from the appropriation is what can go to initial money. And the initial distribution will be based on prior year data. Again, we're no longer going to be looking and waiting for the reallocation of this year to do our calculations for next year. So hopefully we'll be able to complete the allocations earlier. Again, there's a timing issue that I need to mention. Don't let me quit this thing without mentioning it. It's a 9-month EFC less than or equal to the cap, which this year is $4,800, or for the coming year. And one of the changes that was made by the committee is that we're also to consider the AD students who are coming into the universities, and we're to consider persons who transfer into the program with the TEOG. Sheba will be talking more about the TEOG transfer into Texas Grant. But what they're trying to do is make sure we're paying attention to all of the students eligible for initial awards. Okay? We've never done those last 2 steps, and it's going to be interesting and challenging to figure out how to get and where to get the information. Does this make sense to you? Do you feel that this is moving in a direction that's positive? Again, the idea is to get your institution's input as to how it should be done, and then when we get that feedback on the calculations, to make sure you agree that we've quoted your information correctly and are doing it the right way. So for us, it's a nice safety net for the calculations that we're going to be doing. Okay. As you can see, the rules actually include the formulas and the data sources. So it's pretty prescriptive as to how we're going to do this in the future. The deadline for using funds didn't change. What we had in the rules about deadlines was that at a date specified by the coordinating board, institutions have to use their money. Now it's specified in the rule that it will be February 20th. So that won't change from year to year. If it falls on a holiday or a weekend, it's the first working day thereafter. Then the institutions are given those 10 days to review the work. Okay. I mentioned timing. One of the goals of this whole process was trying to get the allocations out to you earlier. Everybody would like to know how much money they're going to have next year before July 1st or something like that. You need it as soon as possible. Most of you have, when are your deadlines for packaging or for applying for aid? 15th of March, pretty much? Okay, well, in a perfect world, we'd have your allocations to you by that date so you would know how much you had and could start packaging right away. Now, the new approach, because it's using prior year data, will make that much more feasible for us in those years that are not legislative session years. And the reason I say that is that the legislature appropriates money every 2 years. And next spring will be legislative session. And the allocation that appropriation they come up with will be for 16 and 17. We will not know what we have for 16 until they make up their minds next spring. And the General Appropriations Act is often the last piece of legislation they pass, which means that even in the future with the new system, In those years when they're legislative session, it's going to be very hard for us to give you good information prior to pretty late in the spring. In the past, we've given you preliminary numbers, warning you up and down everywhere, saying that this may change. And we have seen the legislature take $10 million out of a program in the last weekend of the session. And that's why we say it preliminary, and we're hoping these are good numbers. Now, in the years that there is not a legislative session, so for instance, this past spring was not a legislative session, so going into this year, we knew how much money we were going to have for next year. So in every other year, we should be able to get pretty close to that March 15 deadline, if not before it. That's our goal, is to get this done and get it out to you sooner. So that is one of the major hopes of this process, is it gave us a system that we can set up, because it's using prior year data. We can set up and actually run the numbers sooner, as soon as we know what an appropriation amount might be. Any questions about this process? It has been really interesting. It is not a simple thing for these people on the committee to do. It is very hard to ignore the needs of your institution and try to look at it in a more general sense as to what does the state need to have happen. And it's been a learning process for us as well, as we see where the issues are among the institutions. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. I guess one of the things that comes up is, when will the committees meet again? These committees are one-time things. Now, it doesn't mean that in the future the agency could conclude, based on feedback from institutions, that this system is not working well and we need to do it again. But at that point, it starts from scratch. A whole new committee would be brought together to go through all the steps of being approved, and then meet, come up with a new rule, and it would go through the process. The committees that made these decisions, once their rules are adopted by the board, basically dissolve, and we would start over from scratch. That isn't to say we can't do that. If this doesn't work, we'll figure out what to do better. Okay? Any questions? You all ready to go run with allocations now, huh? I have to admit, we're really pleased to have this kind of background and process in place. It takes some of the pressure off of us to be perfect, which occasionally we fail to do. Okay, the next presentation.
Sheba and Texas Grant. While we're switching the PowerPoints, I just want to bring up two things. The presentation for the online viewers for Jane's presentation, apparently there were some updates made at the last minute, so we will get the other PowerPoint posted as quickly as we can. And we've also had some feedback from some online viewers that you're having trouble seeing the slides, and we are looking into that, and hopefully we can. Teresa says no.
With the way they were designed by the only thing they can do is Zoom.
Okay, we're doing our best we can with the PowerPoints for online viewers. We're being told that it was the way we created the PowerPoints as to why they're not being able to be seen online. So we apologize, and hopefully you can print that out by visiting the GSP website to get actual copies of the PowerPoint, so it's clearer to you. We do apologize for that. So next we're going to go with Sheba Spears to talk about the Texas Grant Program.
Good morning. How's everyone this morning? I'm really wanting this to be an interactive Texas Grant session. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Looking through the registration forms, we have a lot of veterans who are attending the session today. So most of you guys have a lot of information and know a lot about this program. Just before we get started, I know that you guys are in the process of submitting your year-end reports, closing out the year. One or two people give me some feedback on how it went this year. How did the awarding process go? Do you have any questions about the year-end report? Just before we get started, does anybody have any concerns or want to address anything that came up this past year? No?
Sheba, I do have a question from an online viewer, which is really more for Jane's presentation. They are wanting to know when the 14-15 Texas grant allocations will be finalized.
The 14-15, can everyone hear me okay? The 14-15 allocations for Texas Grant and TEOG are currently at the Legislative Budget Board waiting for approval. As you know, for 14-15, the two-year institutions are being phased out of the Texas Grant program and will only be making renewal Texas grants next year. There is a transfer of funds to occur between Texas Grant and the TEOG program for the two-year colleges. There was a rider to the Appropriations Act that indicated that the coordinating board was to calculate how much that transfer was to be and that it was to be approved by the Legislative Budget Board. And that's where it is right now. We are waiting for their approval. The original data that was sent out to everyone about your preliminary allocations was sent out on April the 4th. And not long after that, we took information to the LBB for approval. Now, we did find one adjustment that we had to make to our numbers that probably caused some delay on the part of LBB, but at this point in time, we're still waiting for their approval. That adjustment that I mentioned is reduce the total amount available for Texas Grant by $5 million. So it's not going to have a huge impact on anybody, but we know that that minor adjustment will be impacting everybody because it was taken a little bit out of every institution. But we're just waiting for LBB to say okay, and we'll send out a memo saying that these are and sending you the final allocation amounts. We apologize for the delay, but we're in the same mode as you. We're waiting for approval.
And thank you guys for your patience. Everybody's been really good about the responses when I've been asked about the allocations for next year. We just want to thank you guys for your patience as we work on getting this ready for you guys. So today's presentation for Texas Grant is just going to be an overview of the program. We're going to go over the eligibility requirements, of course, and we're going to talk about funding and the funds request process. And then we'll end the presentation with something new that we've incorporated in our presentations this year, scenarios, real-life scenarios that have either come up this year and we've kind of incorporated in the presentation today, or things that we get questions about, and so we've created a scenario on it. So that's what the presentation is going to be on today. And based on the silence in the room, it sounds like everyone had a great year as it relates to the Texas Grant program. And as we start the presentation, feel free to, if you have questions, folks online, if you have questions, feel free to email with those throughout the presentation. So we're going to start with the initial awards. So you guys, I'm sure, are already looking at those students who are going to be coming to your schools for the upcoming school year. Of course, for all of our programs, students must be a Texas resident. For Texas Grant, they must be an entering undergraduate who have graduated high school under the recommended or the new foundation curriculum program, or any higher high school curriculum program. They can also come in with an associate's degree. All students must be enrolled three-quarter time to participate in the Texas Grant program and be enrolled in an undergraduate baccalaureate program. And this is something new as we begin to phase out Texas Grant in the two-year sector. Students must also demonstrate financial need. This year's EFC cap for initial awards is $4,800. So students who have an EFC of $4,800 or less meet that requirement. And of course, for all of our state programs, students must be registered with the Selective Service or be exempt from that process. And they cannot have a felony conviction as it relates to a crime or a felony in the controlled substance arena. Traditionally, the Texas Grant program had two categories of initial year eligibility. Those are the categories in which a student can receive their first Texas Grant Award. Traditionally, that was out of high school, and students had at least 16 months. They could receive their first Texas Grant Award within 16 months of that high school graduation. And also the associate's degree option. A student who has received their associate's degree and enrolls within 12 months of getting that associate's degree into a four-year institution can also be considered for a Texas Grant Award. Well, something new that has been added to the categories for students being considered for initial award are the military service and those students who are transferring with a TEOG. Military service. These are any students who enlist in the military within 12 months of their high school graduation, and they get honorable discharge and they enroll in your institution within 12 months of that discharge, can be considered for an initial Texas Grant Award as long as they meet the other basic requirements for an initial award. The fun one, the most popular one that we've been spending a lot of time talking about is the TEOG option. This is the 2-year option that's new to the program, that has been created to create a pathway for students who may not finish that associate's degree but have attended a 2-year and decides to transfer into a 4-year institution. Those students can be considered for a Texas Grant Award if they transfer with 24 semester credit hours and have a GPA of 2.5. And they also have to meet those basic Texas Grant requirements. And so this is something that you guys are going to start probably seeing a lot more of coming up in the near future, the military option and the TEOG option. Does anybody have any questions about these two new categories? Yes, Jane.
Remember that the timing for the TEOG, the initial TEOG has to have been in fall 2014 or later?
Thank you. So for the TEOG option, this actually begins this coming fall, 2014. So you may start seeing students in the spring 2015 term that may transfer from that 2-year to a 4-year school, but remember they have to have the 2.5 and the 24 semester credit hours if they transfer in. But that begins this coming fall. Yes, sir, I see you in the back.
There we go. Oh, sorry.
There we go.
Hey, everybody who just saw that, don't do that. Sorry, my bad. Gabriel Mendiola, University of Texas, San Antonio. I actually had a questions on the initial requirements. I'm currently going through a state audit, which Lynn and Sheba, I believe you've been so helpful with. Thank you so much. With selective service, I'm getting a lot of questions from the auditor regarding selective service and the federal match indicator. Now, is it a requirement to have the SSS.gov printout? Because that's what I was required to supply, and not, allow the federal match indicator to say that they registered for selective service be okay in terms of making sure that they met that requirement.
Okay, I'm going to let Lynn answer that question.
I think the auditor can ask you to go ahead and produce that to make sure that the student is actually registered with selective service. You don't have to do that on a regular basis when you're determining eligibility, because you do have that match with the selective service through the ICER process. But if the auditor is wanting to make sure that that student truly is registered, they have the right to ask for that additional documentation. Is that what you're asking?
Right, I just wanted to make sure it wasn't something that had to be a process that had to be implemented.
You don't have to do that as a process, no, because you have that already in place through the FAFSA application process and the match with selective service. But if an auditor comes in to make sure that that student truly is registered with selective service, that may be something that you need to go out and print and produce for them, which is fairly easy to do, right? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
That's a good question, Gabe. And later on this afternoon, we do have some of our internal auditors who will be presenting on compliance and that information. And so it's good because this does come up in audits, and any of these requirements can be questioned by an auditor, and additional documentation may need to be provided in order to meet that compliance. So let's move on and talk about the priority model. This is something that you all have put into place this year. I hope it went well. This is another area that will be looked at in case of an audit. So we're definitely encouraging you, for those students that you identified this past year under the priority model, making sure that that documentation is, you have that supporting documentation in the student's file. But the priority model itself is targeted and impacts those students who graduated from high school after May 2013. This is only for students that you're considering for an initial award. And these are also for students who will be meeting that March 15th priority deadline, that March 15th financial aid priority deadline. The requirements under the priority model, again, most of you guys are familiar with this because this is something you actively had to look at this year. There are 4 areas under which a student can be considered a priority model student. You cannot choose a student, for example, in one area that meets 2 different requirements within that area. So it's important to look at especially the advanced academic programs, because within that one area there's 3 different requirements. You have the dual credits, you have the AP classes, and you have the distinguished IB curriculum. And so I say that because if you have a student who has 12 hours in dual credit and they're graduated under the IB, that does not meet the priority model requirements. The student actually has to meet 2 of the 4 areas, which would include, for example, a B average and graduated under the IB curriculum. Does everybody understand that? That pretty straightforward? Okay. This year on the year-end report, and I know that most of you guys are pulling that data in now, the priority model question is going to be data element number 34. It's the last data element in your report this year. And what's most important about this data element is that we are asking you to identify those who were awarded under the priority, and if not, then we're asking you just to mark that information as well. But this data that we're collecting on the priority model will be used and has already been asked in some cases for our legislators. And so it's very important that this documentation is included in the year-end report. Does anybody have any questions in regards to that data element, or has that been running pretty smoothly as you pull in that information this year? Great, great. Okay, let's talk about the renewal students for a Texas Grant Award. So you're looking at your students who you awarded this year. You're probably looking to see if those students meet the requirements to receive an award for the upcoming year. You're going to have 2 different types of students. You're going to have your first-year students that you gave an award to this past year, and then you're going to have your group of renewal students that you gave your award to this past year. The biggest thing that always comes up is the SAP requirement. And the SAP requirement for initial students, that means that students that you gave an initial award to this year, who you are considering for a renewal award next year, those students only need to meet your school's SAP policy. Now, for your group of renewal students that have been in the program maybe 2 or 3 years, and you're looking to make an award for them for next year, those students must meet the program SAP requirement. And that program SAP requirement includes the 2.5 GPA and the 24-hour completion at the end of the spring term. Students for the renewal award must also still be enrolled in at least 3/4 time. They still must demonstrate a financial need, that there's no EFC cap with your renewal students. They still must be classified as a Texas resident, and they still must meet the terms of the eligibility statement that they filled out during the previous year. Okay? Let's talk about the fun stuff, the use of Texas grant funds. Yes, Jane?
If a person has completed 24 hours at the end of the spring term, can they take hours in the summer to get to 24?
Students can complete summer courses to earn, to meet the 24-hour component and the GPA component to receive an award the following year. If you have students who do make those, because what happens is that at the end of the spring term, when you guys are submitting your end-of-year reports, that student may be indicated as no to SAP. And if that's the case, then the option for the student is summer school to get that GPA or get those hours up for the next year. Those students who do decide to go to summer school would need to bring in college transcript that indicates they made up those hours during the summer, and that information should be documented before making a new award to the student moving forward. Okay? Use of Texas grant funds. The priority of Texas grant funds, as we know, are for the renewal students. So those are your group of students that received an award in the past, and you're going to look to make awards to them first. Based on the targeted award amounts that have been put into place over the past few years, the coordinating board believes that there should be sufficient amount of money still left in the program to make your awards for those students who meet the priority model and the priority financial aid deadline. So there should be enough money to make those priority model awards. Once those students have been looked at, some people may think that you just look at your basic students. Well, yeah, you can look at your basic students, but the next priority is going to be those students who meet the financial aid priority deadline. So whether they're priority model students that you didn't consider before, you still want to look at that priority deadline first for making your additional awards if money is left. Does that make any sense? So you may have students who met the priority financial aid deadline who may not have met the priority model. You would actually look at making an award to that student before you look at another priority model student who didn't complete their FAFSA until after the March 15th deadline. Is everybody good with that? Remember, the priority deadline is used to just prioritize funding. And the good thing about the priority deadline for the Texas Grant Program is that institutions have the flexibility to determine what that means to meet that deadline. Okay. All right, our award amounts for fiscal year 2015, the upcoming school year. For you guys, the target amounts haven't changed. We're still asking for you guys to shoot for that $5,000 for the year, $2,500 for the semester. However, you'll notice that the maximum award amount increased a little bit. And so if there is funding available after you make your initial awards in Texas Grant and you can increase those awards, feel free to do that. As long as you don't match the $8,000, you're okay. But we are asking to stretch the funds to aim for that targeted award amount. And just to review the late or retro disbursements, that does come up throughout the year. If you consider to make a late award to a student or go back and do some retro awards for students, just be sure that you remember that the funds should go towards outstanding balances and or reducing loan amounts for the year. Under no circumstances should a student receive a refund back from the Texas Grant Program. Okay? Moving on to the request for Texas Grant funds. This form looks very familiar to most of you guys because this is the form that we used this year. How did you guys like the online form access? I felt like it was a lot better than the old process of emailing the attachment. It was something that you could click the submit button. It came directly to us. You had an option of making a copy. I hope that worked well for everybody. This is probably one of the most important forms that we receive throughout the year. The contact information from this form we use to create our contact list for the programs. And so the most accurate information on there is always most helpful for us in case we have questions about anything on the form or have any questions that we need to contact any of you regarding. The current request section of the funds request form only deals with what you're currently requesting, what money you're currently requesting for students, and the number of awards associated with that new request. Now, what came up during the spring semester for a lot of institutions was that they were wanting to request funds for students that they had already received money for the prior semester, maybe fall. And what the issue was the student count. The student count for the Texas Grant Program is so important because we're actually reporting student counts throughout the year. And so I know that I may have been hard on some institutions in regards to the student count, but this is something that we use, like Jane mentioned. In the past, we've used it for allocation purposes. We use this student count throughout the year to report to the Legislative Budget Board. And so student count is very important. I say this because in the current section of the funds request form, we only want you to indicate the number of new awards that you're requesting under the current funds that you're requesting, if that makes any sense. So the funding, you can request money for older students, but that you've already counted in your student count, but we're not asking for the double count. We only want to count each student once. And so this current request section should only include the number of new awards that you guys are requesting funds for. And that mostly comes up in the spring term when you guys have identified new students and you're requesting money for the students that have already been identified in the count. The total funds section is where your cumulative totals come into play. So in this section, we want you to include your allocations because we want you to make sure that you're within your allocation for the year when you're requesting your money. In this section, we want you to include the year-to-date total. So we want you to be aware of how much money that you've already requested this year. And that Y-to-date should also include the current requested amount that you're asking for. And then in the student count, this is where you're going to count your cumulative totals. And that's where we're tracking just the total number of students that you've awarded for the year here, and that would include the current student request as well. So in that cumulative amount where it says year-to-date totals will always include the current requested amount and anything that you've previously requested. Okay? If for some reason you submit a request, an original request, and you realize that you need to you made an error on the student count, or for whatever reason you need to submit a revised funds request form, we just ask that you click this revised section instead of the original section option and date, and let us know why you're submitting a revised funds request. Okay? Okay, the student award history file. This is something absolutely new, something that we are still in the testing phase of, but we're so close I can smell it. Over the next month, the Grants and Special Programs area is going to be introducing a process that will allow institutions to submit their transfer student data. Yay! I know this is something that a lot of schools have been wanting for a long time because right now transfer students are self-identifying themselves. There is a way for you to look those IDs up through the Grants and Special Programs website, but you need an ID to do that. And when you don't really know, who are the transfers who may have been participating in the program, or the Grants and Special Programs website only allows you to enter 5 or 10 IDs at a time, this new process is going to allow you to send us a file of all of your transfers and request for us to match that against the Texas Grant database to determine when did they receive their last Texas Grant Award and what was that SAP information associated to that last award. Yay! And this is something that we're going to be rolling out over the next few months. The purpose of this program is to give you guys a secure way to be able to identify those transfer students without them having to self-identify. And so information will be going out, guidelines and instructions will be going out to schools, hopefully over the next few weeks, of how this process will work. But we're hoping that it's user-friendly and will give you guys a lot faster responses on those transfer students. And this is really going to be important, especially when you start having the TEOG transfers from the 2 years to come up. You'll be able to send in a TEOG request file to find out if those students had received the TEOG award in the past. So this will work for students who have received Texas Grant in the past and have transferred, or students who have received the TEOG and have transferred. So this is going to be something really good that's going to be rolling out over the next month. Okay, these are topics that I have put up on the screen. I didn't really include a lot of information. We kind of touched on some of these things, but these are all issues that you guys will see throughout the year. If there's any particular topic that we want to touch on this morning, I'll be more than happy to touch on one of these topics if you have any questions regarding these topics. Yeah, Gabe, I see you in the back.
A question on the proration, on kind of what the guidelines should be regarding proration.
Okay. They are 2 types of prorations that should take place for the Texas Grant Award, and they are in your handout and they're in your guidelines for the upcoming year. Proration for the Texas Grant Award should only be considered for those students who are getting close to their hours of eligibility, and for those students who are going to be receiving a hardship Texas Grant Award. And the proration schedule is on page 3 of the guidelines if you have a copy of the handouts. For an approved hardship, it's the maximum eligibility. It's 100% of the maximum award amount for the semester if they're enrolled in 9 hours or more. So if they're a full-time student and you've received a hardship, they can get the full Texas Grant award. Now, for students who have received a hardship and they're enrolled in less than full-time or less than 9 hours, it's the maximum award for the semester divided by 12 and multiplied by the number of hours the student is enrolled in.
Let me add one thing. They have to be enrolled at least half time to get a Texas Grant Award. You can never give a Texas Grant Award for less than half time. Just as a reminder.
But would we ever give a student, because it requires them to be enrolled 3/4 time to receive it, the normal award as if not a hardship, would that be a proration based on 75%, or would they be eligible for the full 100%?
They'd be eligible for the full 100%.
For those who are getting close to their end of their hours of eligibility, the proration is based on the number of hours that the student has remaining in the program. And so that's how you would prorate those students' awards. And just to note, for the year-end report, because I know this is something you guys are working on now, this information will be documented on the end-of-year report either as a PJ, well, it will be documented as a PJ, either for hardship or student graduating or student is close to their hours of eligibility. That would cause a lot of errors on that end-of-year report. Are there any other topics we want to go over today? The transfer authority. is still, you can definitely still transfer between Texas Grant and Work Study. The option is going away for the TEOG and Texas Grant program. Quiz, how many hours, what's the maximum hours of eligibility that a student has for Texas Grant? All right. And refunds, that usually comes up this time of year. We're asking institutions, because we understand you guys are reviewing your data and reviewing records with the business office. We are asking institutions to hold off on submitting any refunds until we get to the budget aspect of the end of year report, so that we can settle all transfers of money between IY, and all refunds at that time. And it just makes it easier, smoother process if we wait to the end of year report to do that. Important program deadlines, July 15th. You guys, that's our deadline for the end of year reports. We're really pushing this deadline this year because of legislative reports that are already being requested of the program. And so if you have any problems, issues, questions in regards to your data, your file, please give me a call so that we can work together to clear those issues and get you certified. September 1 will be the first day that you'll be able to disperse funds. As you know, February 20th is your deadline to request money from your allocation before you lose that balance or lose any remaining funding that you have available. March 15th, again, I know that we've mentioned that a couple of times today. That's the financial aid priority deadline, as well as the priority model deadline. And May 15th is going to be, of next year, will be your first day for you to submit next year's year-end report. I'm already thinking about next year's year-end report. So the conclusion of the presentation for Texas Grant, just want to go through a couple of real-life scenarios that you may come across throughout the year. The first scenario is you have a student who graduated from high school May 15, 2013 with the recommended high school program curriculum. He attended a 2-year college for the fall 2014 term and received an IY-TEOG award. He transfers to a 4-year institution in the spring of 2015 with a 2.5, 15 semester credit hours, and an EFC of $4,000. Can you consider him for an IY Texas Grant Award under the new TEOG transfer criteria? Let me hear. I see heads, but I want to hear. That's right. He can't be considered under the new TEOG requirement because he hasn't met the 24-hour requirement. Can you consider this student for a basic IY Texas Grant Award? You got it. Yes. You can consider this student for a regular Texas Grant Award because he's coming in as a high school student. He's still within the 16 months of his high school graduation to be considered for a regular IY Texas Grant Award. Scenario 2, talking about requesting funds. You're in the process of requesting Texas Grant funds for the spring 15 term. In the fall, you requested funds for 50 IY students and 100 RY students, so that's a cumulative number of 150. In the spring, you need to request funds for students who received funds for the fall, and you have 25 new IY students and 25 new RY students. Should you only include the 25 new IY and RY student totals in your student count on your current funds request form, even though you're requesting funds for students who receive a fall disbursement? Yes. We only want you to include in that current section, even though you may be asking for $1 million, and only 25,000 of that is going to go to the 50 new students. We just want you to include in that current section for your student count only the new awards. So you would only include the 25 new RY and the 25 new IY students, which would bring you to a cumulative total of, look, my answer went away. Well, the cumulative total, there would be 200 students in your cumulative year-to-date student count section, because you would add the 150 students and the 50 students, new students that you're awarding. Scenario number 3, transfer of Texas grant funds. You have awarded IY Texas grant to all students meeting the priority model, as well as the financial aid priority deadline. You have several more students who meet the priority model criteria, but not the deadline. Do the priority model students have priority of a Texas grant award over the students who meet the basic criteria and met the financial aid priority deadline? Do the priority model students have more edge than the other students? Should we look at those students first? No. No, because the regular IY, we've already met the priority, financial aid priority deadline, so now you can consider regular students who meet the IY requirements to receive a award. If IY funds remain after all eligible priority students who met the financial aid priority deadline have been awarded, any remaining funds from your school's allocation should be awarded to an otherwise eligible student who meets the financial aid priority deadline, and then to otherwise eligible students who did not meet the financial aid priority deadline. And last scenario for this morning, in data element number 14, which is your SAP data, we are to report whether or not the student met SAP at the end of spring 2014. The current instructions indicate in this section a 3-part edit check against SAP. I thought the SAP edit check would only check against the reported GPA and completed hours. Did something change? No, nothing changed, and we realized that this was a typo in the current year instructions, so if you get to that point and you don't freak out, just go ahead and enter the SAP information for that student. The system is only checking the 2.5 and the 24 hours completed. You may also notice that we are still asking for the completion rate, but we are not edit checking that against the student's SAP. So as long as the student has the 2.5 to 24, you want to say yes in that data element. And that would be for your renewal students. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, let's get you a mic.
There we go. Okay, a while ago you were talking about the students who regained eligibility after the end of summer term.
Yes.
Is a report still required for that, or is there an override that we can use?
I'm glad you mentioned that because I didn't. But the summer update file will still be in place for those students. So if you do determine that you have students that did meet SAP during the summer, you will be able to submit a summer update file. You will not be able to submit that summer update file until after all schools have certified their end of year file. Then we will open up the summer update files for you to make those updates to students' records.
I have one more question.
Yes, ma'am.
And this is it pertains to the Texas Grant and Top 10 end of year report.
Okay.
We're a banner school, and we have not upgraded to 8.20, and the mods that TCC made require 8.20. So I'm wondering if there's any other schools here that are on banner and have not upgraded to the 8.20. What are y'all planning on doing? Our upgrade's going in July the 11th.
Schools, feel free to chime in on how you're handling that process. Our online schools, if you are working on this as well, please feel free to email. Let's get you a mic because there may be other schools out there that have that same question.
We are a banner school, but we are already over the 8.2, but we are just doing the TCC models update today. So we should be able to use the TCC to do this, but hopefully it does everything it's supposed to.
Maybe you guys can share information and you guys can get together and see how you're pulling in your file of the data. We encourage schools to work together because we realize that this is a very tedious process, and especially if you're a new financial aid officer who's coming on board, who's never had to submit an end-of-year report. That's one good thing about these workshops. You can network and work together on those type of things. Okay, if there's no more questions, here's my contact information. Most of you guys have that information already. For those who don't, I am more than happy to answer questions. Please feel free to either call or email me. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions outside of the workshop today. I would encourage anyone who's not set up on the distribution list for the Grants and Special Programs area to make sure that you go to that link and add yourself to that distribution list. It's probably one of our key vehicles that we use to get information out to institutions. Your allocations will go out through that listserv, a lot of your guidelines, any instructions. So if you're not on that listserv, please sign up as soon as possible. And with that said, I want to thank everyone.
I have one question.
Yes.
I'm wondering, on the priority model, I know students need to meet 2 out of the 4.
Correct.
One of my staff asked me, should we give priority to the students who meet 4, 3 over the ones who just meet the 2 when we award?
Well, that's not in statute. I don't know if Lynn or Jane wants to chime into that. It's not in statute that you give extra priority to students for meeting all 4. I don't know if we should encourage you to do that, or probably not.
I would say no. The requirement is 2 out of the 4 areas. So, and then since it's a priority deadline thing, it probably would be more appropriate to prioritize on the basis of completion date than additional priorities. But that's my answer to that. What would be your answer to that?
I would agree that it's probably your call. If your school chooses to do that, you could do that, but there's no requirement for that at all.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good, though. You have students that's meeting all 4.
Yes. I haven't done it, but staff asked me, do you do that? And I was like, no, it's 2 out of 4. I do it by date, but I wonder if anybody has thought of doing that.
Before I leave today, I just want to encourage you to use your guidelines as a Bible type for Texas Grant. If you have any questions, most of the things that we've covered today are included in the handout. They are included in your guidelines. And again, if you have any questions after today's presentation, feel free to contact me by phone or email. And it's been a pleasure being able to speak with you guys this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, we finished a little bit early, so we get to take a break. So we'll take about a 15-minute break, and then we have coffee, and I believe Jane made some cookies as usual, and there's some water over here. There is a vending area if you go out, and instead of going right to the restrooms, if you go left and before the glass doors, make another right. You cannot use cash. You have to use a card. So I am not an expert on doing that process because I've never purchased anything down there, but any of these people will probably be able to help. But we'll start back again about 10:30.
Much like Sheba's, we're going to incorporate some scenarios and get some feedback from you guys, see how everything is going for Top 10. I am going to be discussing the eligibility requirements. I'm going to briefly touch on the end-of-year report and then focus some attention on the reimbursement file, which is upcoming. Let's talk about eligibility requirements. Top 10 is a little special. The eligibility requirements are universal. For some of the requirements, they're universal. Both initial and renewal needs to meet these requirements. They need to be registered or Texas residents, registered for selective service. They also all have to meet the program need requirement. That's initial and renewal have to meet this program need requirement. The requirement is cost of attendance minus EFC minus Pell equals greater than 0. That's for initial and that's for renewal, which is a little different than Texas Grant, where they only have an EFC requirement for your initial students and not the renewal. If the need component is met, the student actually can get a maximum award even if it exceeds the calculated need. Let's just do a scenario. I have a student who requested the maximum student loan amount. If I award this amount to the student, it exceeds the calculated need. Can I award the maximum student loan amount? I'll walk around and someone's going to help me answer this question. Hello. Nuh-uh. I didn't print the answers.
Well, the regulations, because it says that an applicant is determined to have need, so we're saying his cost of attendance minus his EFC minus the Pell exceeds. So he still has some remaining need, but he will exceed. And you said no, that if the student component is met, the student can receive up to the maximum award.
It is confusing. They can receive the maximum award, but because it's matched up with student loans, which is limited to calculated need, then you really can't give the maximum award. Because, yes, as a matter of fact, that's correct. In this case, we actually would recommend that you reduce the loan and give them the maximum top 10 award. But because it's matched with the loan, you can't exceed calculated need. If they didn't have the loan, you could exceed calculated need. It's one of those unique state programs that actually can exceed calculated need.
And in that scenario, she's talking about a need-based loan.
I was talking about a need-based loan. Okay, other requirements that apply to all recipients, both initial and renewal. They must enroll full-time in the fall semester through the census date, and they must complete their FAFSA in time to generate CPS result in a non-rejected status by March 15th or submit their TASFA to the Financial Aid Office by March 15th. This is universal. Everyone has to meet this every single year. Let's do a scenario. Walk over here. My student submitted the FAFSA application on time this year, but March 15th deadline fell on a Saturday. For that reason, can I accept the ICER date Monday, March 17th? Veronica?
Unfortunately, no.
No.
Right. Yeah, we've had this question come up several times. We've had to say no.
No. Yeah, even though the deadline was on a Saturday this year, all applicants needed to submit their application in time to generate results by the deadline. So they actually had to submit it so that the CPS results were there on Friday. You cannot accept that Monday date, even though the deadline was on Saturday. I have also been receiving a lot of calls. I submitted it on Saturday. You guys aren't counting it. No. So we have initial eligibility. Complete the Distinguished Achievement Curriculum or its equivalent. Rank in the top 10% of their high school graduating class in the 7th or 6th semester, depending on the one that you use for admissions. What is new for this upcoming year is the foundation students. They have to have the distinguished endorsement. If they do not have the distinguished endorsement, they are not meeting the criteria. Any questions? Good. Let's do a scenario. Let's see. You seem into it. I have a student who was unable to enroll in the fall semester right after high school graduation to our institution due to a medical condition. Are we at liberty to award the top 10% scholarship to the student through a hardships consideration?
Hello. Hello. I actually don't work at a school, so I would probably be calling y'all on this one. But I would think yes.
Anybody else think yes? I see yes. You think yes? No? The answer is no. There are no hardship provisions for initial students. You have to be enrolled. You have to be a renewal. So unless you enrolled immediately preceding your high school graduation that fall, you cannot. You basically forfeit your eligibility for the top 10% scholarship. So there are no hardship. I got in a car accident. My mom died. Sorry. Unfortunately, unless you enroll full time, receive the initial award that first fall semester, there is no hardship. Renewal eligibility. I received that all renewal eligible students must receive an initial top 10% award that first fall semester preceding high school graduation, successfully complete 30 semester credit hours at 75% completion rate, and maintain a 3.25 GPA. Low standards. Just kidding. Okay, that's the end of my eligibility requirements. Does anybody have any questions? No? Everybody's eligible? Good. All right, the top 10 end of year report, I'm just briefly touching on it. You guys are currently submitting it. I think it's one of the easiest end of year reports because all of your students on that report need to match your request file. Unlike anywhere else, I already know who you gave the award to. I do get a question quite often, and this is it. I have a student that I recently determined is not eligible for top 10. Can I award these funds to an otherwise eligible student?
I would say no.
Why? Why?
I mean, if they were meeting the requirements by submitting their FAFSA and having it processed before March 15th, they should have gotten it anyway.
Correct. Unlike other state aid, top 10%, we identify the recipients through the reimbursement process. So the awards are issued on a student-by-student basis, and they are not transferable. If you determine a student is ineligible during this end-of-year process, you have to refund the money. Any questions? Okay, here's the fun part. It's a little early, but the reimbursement file is right around the corner, and we've made some changes due to some recommendations made from institutions. Always remember, or keep in mind, that the deadline for the reimbursement file is October 1st. That means that all the students' files must be submitted without errors. If you do have any duplicate warnings, those need to be cleared before the October 1st deadline in order to receive payment for that student. And also, if you have any ICER verification pending, those verifications need to be cleared before the October 1st deadline in order for the award to be paid. So even if they meet all eligibility requirements, they've submitted their FAFSA in March 15th and they're eligible, they had their verification pending, and they come into your office on October 2nd and say, here's my paperwork. I'm eligible, right? No. Unfortunately, it's too late. We can't reimburse that student's award. I'm sure you guys all seen the new award amounts. How does everybody feel about these new awesome award amounts? You love them? No, didn't think so. All right, the initial year is $600, and for renewal, it's $1,000. We are still only awarding priority 1. That's because limited funding, so there are no priority 2 students. That ICER date is really important. And since it's so important, I do want to also mention that we will not be issuing payments until after the October 1st deadline. So if you request your money, and the ability to request funds is going to be opened, I think it's August 1st, you may not receive payment for those students until October 1st, until we know we have all the funds to award all of the students. Let's do a scenario. We'll walk over here. I have a student that received an initial award through University A. However, we, University B, were not listed on the FAFSA Transaction 1. We did not receive the FAFSA transaction 2 until after the March 15th deadline. Is it possible for her to provide us with a printed copy of her ICER transaction 1 record reflecting the error-free submission, or is she ineligible to receive an award at University B?
I would say she's ineligible.
Anybody else would say she's ineligible? Hands up. Okay. What would you say?
I would say she would be eligible.
You are correct. She actually would be eligible. The later transaction date can be used as far as determining eligibility, but for the program, you can use the earlier transaction date as far as meeting the requirement. I don't know if that says that there. Okay. New changes to the reimbursement file. Error reports will now be called rejected. Main reason is we had a school submit a file. The only error that they had was their header, and it looked like nothing else was wrong with the file. It was unclear to them that we were actually rejecting all of their students requested because they made a mistake on their header. So now the file record says rejected. If you have any errors, even a header or trailer error, your file is going to be rejected. So it's important for you to remember that even though you don't see any student errors on the file, you have to correct all errors in order for the file to be accepted and for the awards to be made. We also made some updates on the accepted file email. If a file is accepted, you will receive this email notification. It'll show your requested amount, and it'll also show your approved amount. There may be a difference there. You may have requested $1 million for 1,000 students, and I only approved 500 students because 500 of them you told me were pending ICER verifications. So if you see a discrepancy there, be aware that there are either duplicates or pending ICER verifications. We noticed last year when we sent approved emails, people were like, great, my whole request was approved, and in fact only half or sometimes a quarter of them were actually approved. The rest were not approved for payment. This way it's clear. If you have any questions, you can call me and I can help you and send a list of your duplicate students or any ICER verification pending students so you can start clearing those as you go through the process. All right. Again, there are warnings. Duplicates are warnings. ICER verification pending is a warning. They will allow your file to process. They will allow all of your other records to be accepted, but they will be in pending status until they are cleared. You don't have to have there is no SAP eligibility for a request file. So the SAP determination, there's no summer update file needed. If the student is eligible, then they're eligible. You don't have to do a summer update file. If you know they went to summer school, they met the 3.25 requirement, you didn't report it that way on the end of year report, you don't need to send me a summer update to request the money. The end of year report and the request file are two completely different things. So as long as you know they're eligible, you can request funds for them. You can just update that information when you're doing the end of year reporting process, show that you did prove or you did check that they were eligible at that time during the end of year process. You will receive via PDF in a secure file transfer a listing of all the students that were paid and the amounts that they were awarded. Since we're waiting till October 1st, this is not going to be piecemealed, it'll be a full file. Because I'm only going to pay you at the end. So this should make it easier, because sometimes I send out, I paid you 4 students, and then 10 more, and now 100 more, and 200 more. Now it'll all just be one file that'll reflect all the students that I paid you for the year, initial, and then renewal. That's a good thing. Yeah, it gets confusing. You're looking for the student to see if they got paid, and you can't see them on a file. Questions?
This is kind of a nitpicky question, but on those files, is it possible to have the names in alphabetical order?
I can ask.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
It would They would be helpful.
It would be I can ask. I don't know why it wouldn't be possible, but I can definitely ask. I think it's just an order of the way that you submit it. So submit it alphabetically. I'm just kidding. Touche. All right. I have some contact information for you. Please subscribe to the our listserv. If you haven't done it, subscribe. We're not sending, constant emails. When we send an email, it's a memo or a notification or something we really want you to read. We won't bombard you and say, "Good morning, it's Monday." No. So if you haven't already signed up, or encourage all of your staff to sign up so they just stay in the loop. Because it's hard for us when we send something out and then they call and they're like, "Oh, I didn't get the notification." We're like, "Oh, we sent it." So, all right. Any questions regarding top 10%? Yes.
I think I can talk where y'all can hear me.
Well, it's for the online.
Oh, the online. Turn it. Okay, we had an issue on our data loads. We had a new person doing our initial data loads, and it was like 2.5 months worth of files at one time. She missed 3 files, and we didn't find out about it until after March 15th. So when we loaded them into our software, it's showing March 18th or later as the receive date, but we actually had them prior to that. When we pull the reports have the date that we uploaded them into our system. Is that going to cause us an error?
Yes.
Okay, what can we do to alleviate that error? Because we can't change the date on our software.
I'm going to turn to A&M. Any suggestions? One second. Because we have this
manually
issue.
Update it.
Yeah, we had this issue before.
If you're pulling that particular date from your student system, then when you actually get the file, just manually go in and make those dates. Because if you still show a date after March the 15th, which we have had institutions do, those will be rejected, and very seriously rejected this year because of the limited funding.
Right. We are 100% rejecting anyone who has an ICER process date after March 15th. We're not even going to keep those records. We don't want to confuse you. We're not paying them. So it'll be very clear that if that error is there, that you need to make that update to the file if they are eligible. Great question.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. Okay. All right. Well, this is the end of my presentation.
We are way ahead of schedule. So why don't we take this moment before we start with exemptions and waivers and just see if you've had any questions come up about anything we've talked about thus far with the allocation or the negotiated rulemaking process or with Texas Grant or with Top 10. Is there anything that you've thought of since we've actually done the presentations that you would like to ask? I'd also like to remind the online listeners that if you have a question, if you will send that in to the email address, it's FA for financial aid, FA meeting at thecb.state.tx.us. I'm manning the email address so that I can make sure that your question is asked and is answered while we're here. So any other questions, or we're just going to keep going? And
I have one comment on the top 10.
Sure.
The requirement is that the FAFSA be processed by March 15.
Processed and timed to generate the results by CPS in a non-rejected status by March the 15th.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So to answer her question, it shouldn't matter when we load the ICER because it's not the date that we received it in our system, but the day it was processed. So you guys may be picking up the wrong date in the report.
Last year we didn't have an option.
Just a second because of the, I'm sorry, but.
Okay, last year we didn't have an option on the parameters for running the report. It pulled the date that the FAFSA was actually loaded because it asks for the mnemonics you use on the tracking screen.
We use a web focus report for top 10, I don't know if you guys use WebFocus. No? I was like, because I could share it, but we don't use TCC for top 10.
We know that's a difficult part about this program, but that it is the date that the ICER was actually produced, and it depends on what you're pulling into your system on what you actually have available to you. And we understand that, but it's meant to be geared toward the student's application, not when the school processes. So, anything else? That was a good question. Good comment. Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then with exemptions and waivers a little bit early.
Thank you. I actually have a couple of follow-up questions about top 10 since we have a little bit of time. We're getting into, the coordinating board is getting into what they call the legislative appropriation request process, which means we interact with the legislature about funding for programs and that kind of thing. I guess one of the questions that we have going into this next legislative session is whether the top 10 program should be continued if the funding is not significantly higher than it is now. The goal of the top 10 program was to encourage students who graduate in the top 10 to stay in Texas and go to college, to quote unquote stop the brain drain of these really top students leaving. You look at the size of the awards and you wonder whether that's going to have that kind of an impact on someone. We've talked to some institutions about whether the program should just be allowed to end or phase out, handling renewal only. And some of the schools, the feedback we get is any money we can get for any student is useful. And so I'd like feedback from this group. Is the top 10 program something we should continue fighting to get money for, or should we look towards going to, using that money in some other program? We'd love to hear your comments. Anyone have an idea? Something to share? Is it a program we should continue?
In my opinion, I agree with what they had told you. I think it's a good program. I think we should continue, encourage the students to try to graduate top 10. Even though I don't like the amount, I don't think it should be less than 1,000 at least, but I think it makes a difference when the student sees the award letter and they see an extra because I graduated top 10.
Okay.
So I think it does make a difference on the student, even though the amount may be not significant, but entice them, like you said, primarily to stay in Texas.
Okay, that's good to hear. Anyone, do you generally agree with that? Another question that I have is the way the program is administered right now is actually based in Rider. And one of the things that we've talked about in-house is drafting language that would where we would end up with statutes governing the administration of the program, which could open up the opportunity of moving to an allocation type approach for the program, so that institutions would know how much money they're going to have in the program and can make their own awards based on that. Have no idea if this idea is going to go forward, but I would like to get your input as to whether it's something you think would be a good move for the program. Anyone have thoughts to share on that? Please. I saw a few heads nodding, but would this be an improvement over the current setup, do you think? It creates more work for the coordinating board, but it creates maybe a bit more certainty for you as to what you're going to have for the coming year. If there's not enough money for everyone to get the full award, you could make the decision to lower it a bit to pass it out to everybody who's eligible. Those are the kinds of thoughts that went through our head as we considered suggesting this.
Would you rather it be more of an allocation where we actually give you the amount and we're not having to do it the way we're doing it now, where it's a guessing game? Would it not be easier for you if it were an allocation-based program where you have the amount and then you know how much you have to spend in the program? I'm asking. I know what it would be if I were at the school level.
Okay. Again, see some nods, no comments. Okay.
Jane, I do have a question from an online listener. She wanted me or someone to clarify about how we're going to be funding the program this upcoming year. Sophia mentioned that we're not going to be paying until after all reports are submitted by the October 1st deadline. And we will be, in the event that we do not have enough money to fund everyone that's in the reports that are submitted by that October 1st deadline, how are we going to go about determining which students we will not fund? And it's not going to be based, as some thought, on when you submit your report. That's not what it's going to be based on. So if you submit your report on October 1st, that's not going to be treated any differently than an institution that submits a report September the 1st. What we're going to look at is that date that the student's ISER was generated in a non-rejected status, that you are reporting on your submission files. We're going to look at that date, and the later, if we have to limit funding, we will do it on a first-come, first-served basis based on that date. So it's students who completed that are reported, who completed March 15th. That will possibly not be funded. We're keeping our fingers crossed that we have enough funding to award everyone. This is just in the event that we do not have enough money to meet the needs of all the students that are reported. Does that make sense? Do y'all need any additional clarification on that? It's not based on when you submit the file. It's based on the ISER date reported on the file.
And then if they submit the report on October 1, that would be late, wouldn't it not? They have to be submitted before October 1, or can they be reported?
No, it's March 15th deadline, priority deadline. They have to submit the report by October 1st, but the date that the student's ISER was produced has to be March the 15th or earlier.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk about exemptions and waivers. As you could tell from the agenda, I'm not the person that you expected to hear from, and I hope I can fill in for Connie adequately. Exemptions and waivers, how many of you actually work on them in your office? A few of you. Okay. If only a few of you work with them in your office, why should we spend time on exemptions and waivers? Loaded question. Yes, ma'am.
Because it affects the financial aid one way or another once they get the exemption or the waiver. So we still have to work with the registrar's office or whomever, even if we're not the ones directly administered.
Right. Because an exemption or waiver impacts cost of attendance, which impacts what you can package to go with it. And another way of looking at it, thank you, good answer, is that if you're trying to maximize the impact of the financial aid that you have, if you knew who was going to get exemptions and waivers, you can kind of work around them and target other students to try to spread out the wealth. You know, a waiver can be for the full difference between non-resident and resident tuition. Or in the case of the Good Neighbor Scholarship, it's all of tuition. That is a huge decrease in cost for the student who manages to get that award. And so it's kind of a way, if you get familiar with these programs and you run into students who are eligible for them, but maybe didn't know that they could qualify, you can help them tremendously by getting them into one of these exemption and waiver programs and therefore decreasing the cost in a way that you don't have the financial aid to do it. Last year, well, actually in 2013 was the last year that we had data for it. There were 242,000 students in Texas who got either an exemption or a waiver in 2013, and the value of the waived tuition and fees was over $632 million. That's more than Texas Grant, TEG, TEOG, all of that combined. So finding out about exemptions and waivers might really help you stretch your financial aid dollars. Now, there's one thing I need to warn you about. This money is not reimbursed by the state. So it comes out of the hide of your institution. But most of these, or a significant number of these programs, are mandatory. If an eligible student identifies him or herself to your school, you have to make the award to them. And so by having the information available where it's readily accessible to these students might really be able to help them a lot in the long run. Okay, any questions on that angle? If you get involved in outreach to get students to enroll in your institutions, high school counselors or high school PTO meetings and such would be a really nice way to spread the word about exemption and waiver programs. The hardest thing about these programs is you can't look at an audience and figure out who qualifies. You can't tell that that person's father was killed in the line of duty as a peace officer. You can't tell that someone else was the child of a veteran who's serving overseas, that kind of deal. And so they have to self-identify to be able to get them this aid. And so you've got to get the word out to them for them to know to even step up. I had one foster care student, actually the parent, contact me a couple of years ago. And she said, I am so pleased. My foster daughter now has figured out what she wants to do, and she wants to go to college. This is where she wants to go and all this kind of stuff. She had missed the deadline for free tuition and fees for life by about 2 weeks because she didn't know. And so, and there's no way that I could turn that around and make that not true. These programs are really, really important for the people who can qualify for them. And if you can help get the word out, that would be very, very good. Okay, ready to go? All right. One of the hardest things about these programs is if you try to read the statutes about them, they're very confusing. They're kind of sloppy about the wording that they use. What we've done at the coordinating board is tried to come up with terms and use them consistently, so at least normally when we're talking about something, people know what we're talking about. To us, exemptions are programs that allow residents or non-residents to pay a reduced tuition and or fee amount. All right? It can be foster care, blind or deaf. It is both residents, it could be residents or non-residents. The other thing you got to know is each program has its own little requirements. Some of them will specifically state residents, some of them do not, so they're open for residents and non-residents. For instance, the foster care indicates you have to have been under the conservatorship of the Texas Department of Protective Services, but you don't have to be a resident. So you may have been under their care when you were a child and come back here to go to college, and you could qualify for that exemption, which is for tuition and fees. Nice exemption. Okay, waivers, on the other hand, in our terminology, are programs that are only for non-residents. It allows them to pay a lowered tuition rate. Some programs, like the Good Neighbor Scholarship, eliminate tuition altogether. Most of them lower it to the resident rate, and a few of them go somewhere in between. Okay? Optional programs. Those are ones that when you look at the statute, they say the governing board of an institution may do something. It doesn't say shall. If it says shall, it's not optional. It is mandatory. If it says may, it is optional. If it says is entitled to, that's a mandatory program. Like the Hazelwood Act talks about the students being entitled to certain benefits. So optional is the one that the college gets to choose whether they make awards or not, but if they can make the awards, they probably are obligated to make it to everyone they identify as eligible. Exemptions and waivers can only be used for courses that generate formula funding. What the heck is formula funding? Formula funding is tax support that comes to your institution for offering courses. Some of your courses are formula funded, some are not. If they are not, the student cannot get an exemption to go to that class. And the reason is that if your institution is not getting formula funding, how do they support offering that class? Tuition and fees. So if you take away tuition and fees, how does the class continue? And so they have that exemption or that restriction in statute. Any questions about these basics? Yes, ma'am. Here you go.
For the competitive academic scholarship, those are optional. But up there it says, if the institution makes such awards, it must make them to all eligible students. I seem to remember, I think, at our school, we have a limit on the number of those that we give out. So what's the difference there?
Okay. The competitive scholarship program is one of the very few out there that indicates that no more than X% of the students on a campus can be receiving this award. And so in that case, that restriction overrides this basic rule. But it's the only one that I know of that has that kind of a restriction.
Does the school have the option to change that and award less than that percentage?
Oh, definitely. It's not a minimum percentage that you have to award, it's that you can't award more than that percentage of your students. So definitely below that is what they're aiming for. Yeah. The value of the competitive scholarship, though, in statute can't be less than $1,000, and you can't lower that. Okay? That's the minimum threshold. Okay? Senate Bill 1210 is turning out to be my nemesis. It was passed in 2013, whatever the last session was, and it adds some requirements for receiving exemptions and waivers. There are a lot of little except that kind of things, and we'll talk about those. It applies beginning with continuation awards in fall 2014. So this coming fall is the first time that it will go into effect. But it does not have any grandfathering. None of the students who may have been receiving exemptions or relevant waivers coming up until fall 2014 are exempted from this requirement for fall 14. So you can have someone who's been going along doing great and turns out that the GPA is too low to get it in the fall. So it's important to help your college identify these students and get the word out to them so at registration you don't have a whole lot of really surprised students and angry ones. Okay. A student who fails to meet the requirements that we're going to talk about can get back in the program once they raise their GPA to meet the requirement. But as long as they're out of compliance with that, they would not be eligible to get a continuation award in these programs. Okay. Any questions? Okay. There's one correction that I'll point out on this as we move through it. There are two conditions or requirements that get put in by the Senate Bill 1210. One of them applies to graduates and undergraduates, exemptions and waivers, and it has to do with a GPA. It is not SAP. It is not all of that is SAP. It is GPA only. So you could have someone who has a high GPA but didn't meet your other SAP requirements who could qualify for one of these programs as long as they meet your financial aid GPA requirement. All right? They very specifically only picked out the GPA component. So you can't deny an exemption or waiver to someone who met the GPA but not other parts of your SAP. All right? The GPA requirement applies to residents and non-residents, graduates and undergraduates, and no matter what degree plan they're in. It's just across the board. All right? The other requirement has to do with having excess hours. Some of you have probably run into the situation where you have a student who has been on campus for a very long time. They're getting an exemption from tuition and fees, and so they sign up for courses, drop a few, sign up for courses, drop a few, because it's not costing them much money. And those students can rack up a lot of hours, and the intent of this aspect of Senate Bill 1210 was to stop that kind of abuse. Now, what's crazy and has been really difficult for us to figure out is the cross-reference to 54014. You are all at universities, and you may be familiar with there's already a provision in there for taking excess hours, 30 hours beyond your degree plan. And that is the limit that they're talking about in this restriction. used to be that, let's say you had someone who had reached that 30 hours beyond their degree, and your institution chose to exercise what you can do in 54014, which is now raise their tuition. Because what happens is when you get to that 30 hours beyond your degree plan, they quit giving formula funding. You lose your tax support for that student in that class. So they said, okay, if we're going to do that, college, you have the option, if you want to raise the tuition for that student as high as the non-resident tuition rate. We get calls on occasion from students saying, how did I become a non-resident? You know, I've lived here all my life and so forth. Nope, you didn't become a non-resident. You're just now being charged the non-resident rate because you've taken too many hours and the college can't cover the costs since you're getting an exemption. But in the old system, an exemption from tuition, if it were a mandatory exemption, would override that limit. So the student who had too many hours but had an exemption got an exemption from the non-resident tuition now instead of the resident. So that's the catch-22 kind of situation we've gotten into. When we talk to the two-year colleges, we're going to have to go into some other things because we have on this thing that it only applies to people in baccalaureate degrees. What that really should say, it only applies to people who are in that range of getting 30 hours beyond their degree. And if you have a student in an architecture degree where it's more than 120, then they have a few more hours that they could take. If someone took an associate's degree, what I found out last week is that, yeah, they're subject to the limit, but the limit is 30 hours in excess. If they go back to school, they get their associate's degree and then go back to school, now they are pursuing probably a baccalaureate degree, and they're now under the 120 hours plus 30. So it's really going to be odd for the two-year college student to be impacted by this much at all. Okay? Shall we move on? All right. Just to keep people on their toes, Senate Bill 1210 said, "Thou shalt do this except for these programs." These are the exceptions. These are the programs to which these do not apply. Dual credit exemption. You know, if a student is enrolled in high school and college and getting dual credit courses, there is an exemption that allows the institution to lower the tuition and fee rate. May lower it to 0, may lower it to whatever they want to, but they can lower it. And the ability to do that is not impacted by Senate Bill 1210. So there's not a GPA requirement for that dual credit exemption. Obviously, the hour thing probably isn't going to come up. Foster care exemption, that's another program. And why would foster care be accepted? Anybody know? Huh? It's really because the sponsor of the bill 2012, or 1210, is Senator Zaffirini, who is a huge proponent of the foster care program. And she's a very strong advocate for foster care students. So she put that in from the get-go. That was an exception. Most of these others were things that happened as the bill went through the legislature, and other little groups advocated for these populations. I would not be at all surprised if in the next session the blind and deaf group work to get an exception passed. We'll see. But, okay, if you have an ex-prisoner of war, and I think each year we have maybe one of those statewide, that person is not subject to it. Hazelwood, though, it's a big deal. And that's a terrible way of describing it, but it's an accurate way of describing where Hazelwood comes into play with Senate Bill 1210. They did not say Hazelwood is exempted. It said these people in these sections of Hazelwood are exempted. And the group that they pointed out that are exempted are the spouse and children of deceased veterans. The veteran has to meet the requirements. The spouse and child of a disabled vet has to meet these requirements. But if the veteran is deceased and the surviving spouse or children are involved, they don't have to worry about the GPA or the hour limit. Go figure. They decided that this shouldn't apply in general to waiver programs if they're allowing a student to pay the resident rate. So kind of across the board, waiver programs that allow you to pay the resident rate are not impacted by this, which means only a few of the waiver programs are under consideration. And then when we read the fine print in the bill, it says exemptions and waivers in this section. And what we realized from that is that they were saying it only applies to exemptions and waivers authorized in subchapter D of chapter 54 of the Education Code. Kind of drives you nuts, doesn't it? If you look at the materials below the slides, you have a table that looks like this. This is probably iteration 15 of this table, because every time we look at it, we find something else we need to change. But it was our attempt, it still is our attempt, to give some guidance as to what programs are subject to 1210 and which ones are not. Even more so, for those of you not familiar with exemption and waiver programs, this is where you can find out what statutes govern the different programs. Let's say you're talking about the blind and deaf. That exemption program is in Texas Education Code 54-364. So you know where to go and find the statute. Where is the peace officer exemption? Anybody? Pardon? Right, 54, 35, 31. So this kind of gives you a cross-reference of where to go in statute to find the statutes for these programs. Most of these programs do not have rules. The coordinating board doesn't have rule-making authority for most of these. There are a few that are exceptional. So most of them are administered by the institution as it interprets the statute. So what you see in statute is basically all you get in understanding how those programs work.
Jane, I have an online question.
Yes, ma'am.
If Senate Bill 1210 looks at excess credit hours, why is it that we could have a Texas grant student who has not received the program for 150 semester credit hours, has remaining Texas grant eligibility, but is now paying non-Texas or non-resident tuition, whose non-resident tuition we have to match with non-loan money? This seems inconsistent. She has a good point.
That's not one I can answer on the fly. We'll be glad to. Let me think about that one. One thing that you will find is that statutes are not necessarily consistent in what they put out there. You know, you'll have one thing that says this can't be done, and this one overhead, sure, go ahead and do it. So connecting the Texas grant restrictions to this restriction is not one I've done before, so I reserve the right to say I don't know, but I will be glad to get back in touch with them and see what answer we can go. That's a dodge, in case you hadn't noticed. And tell them I'm sorry, but we will try to get back to them with an answer.
And I'm not sure it was a question. She was just saying,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's
Just an
not really a
observation.
question because that's the way it is, but she was just saying it seems inconsistent.
Yeah. Actually, I don't want to get distracted from this. Let's go on from here. Okay, hardship overrides. One of the things the legislature has figured out is that you can put out a rule, and it makes all sorts of sense to have a rule, but there are circumstances when you need to be able to wiggle around it, that there are hardship situations that we need to have consideration for. We said before that there's no hardship provisions for top 10. You know, the student who didn't enroll in the fall because the mother was in a car accident or she was in a car accident, you would think logically there'd be some way to help that student. But that program doesn't have it. In this case, where they added these restrictions to exemptions and waivers, they did specifically put in some hardship provisions. And in fact, they added this one last one, which is often in I think it's in Texas Grant and TEOG and such, good cause acceptable to institution. So one of the interesting things that comes up with these exemptions as waivers is that should people who are blind or deaf be considered to have a hardship that would allow them to take extra hours or have a lower GPA? I don't have an answer to that question, but these kinds of things can come up. As in most cases of professional judgment, it needs to be decided on a case-by-case basis. But at least they attempted to say, hey, if these provisions are really inappropriate for the students in this situation, you have the authority to give some special consideration. Yes, ma'am.
Where would that responsibility lie?
I'm sorry.
Where would that responsibility lie to determine?
The question is, where does that responsibility to grant an exception to these requirements, and that would be at the institution. The office that is administering the program would have the authority, if the student provided documentation that the institution felt was adequate, to go ahead and allow a person to receive an award even though they don't meet these new requirements based on hardship. Yes, ma'am.
Are we able to use like an existing SAP appeal if they have one on file, or would they have to do yet another appeal for the exemption?
It's a good question. If the student already has been granted special handling due to a hardship, my guess would be that if the institution had adopted that hardship provision for the exemptions and waivers, that same documentation could be used in both cases.
One more question. What if they appeal, I know this is for GPA, for the GPA SAP component, but if they're not meeting the undergraduate credit limitation and they do that appeal separately, but they have both issues going on, would they then still have to do another appeal for the GPA?
In this case, in order to get an exemption, they have to meet the GPA requirement or be granted an exemption from that requirement. So they would definitely have to address that to get the exemption.
So they'd have to appeal for both.
Right, right. Good questions. Where's Connie when you need her? Okay. Whoops, sorry. The other thing that is in Senate Bill 1210 is that when it says you can't have excess hours, it then says, but you exclude these hours in your count. You have a copy of that bill, by the way, in your materials behind the table that we were just looking at. Hours earned exclusively through examination are not counted towards the count of having 30 hours beyond the 120-hour limit. Hours for a course that generated college and high school credit, which are your dual credit courses. Required hours for developmental ed. Now, some of your institutions may have academic assessment decisions that are based on different criteria. In other words, it might be over here that the academic folk are saying, no, you've got to pay attention to this or that. If you're talking about an exemption or waiver, these are the things that can be excluded. You go by these restrictions or exceptions as opposed to what your academic office might. It can get very confusing. But these are the ones in the statute. Okay, waivers. The statute specifically indicates it doesn't apply to a waiver. And remember, what does a waiver do? It lets a non-resident pay lower tuition rates. Okay, and that's a distinction that's important. What she said was that it allows the non-resident to pay the resident rate. For those programs, Senate Bill 1210 doesn't apply. Okay? But let's say you didn't have that particular kind of a program, but you had a program that lets you pay a lowered tuition rate, but not all the way down to resident. They would apply in that case. Now, you could have arguments as to whether the author of the bill intended that to be true, but the wording of the bill would indicate that if you are not allowed to pay the resident rate based on a waiver, then the provisions of the statute do apply. I'm going to grab my water. I'll be right back. Thank you, ma'am. This stuff always chokes me up. It's the plot. Okay. The extra hour limitation doesn't apply to waivers, and that's because, it cross-references 54014, which is all about residents in Texas. And these waivers have to do with non-residents. So the excess hour requirement doesn't apply to waivers. And the GPA, as far as we can tell in looking at what is paid for in tuition, it would not apply to these programs. The border state, border county waivers, where you live in, the students attending Texarkana College, and they live in Texarkana, Arkansas, or whatever is right on the other side of the border, they can allow them to come in and pay the resident rate or pay a reduced rate. But what they pay in that case is not the resident rate, unless the resident rate is what a Texan would pay in Arkansas if attending a school there. It's based on reciprocity. So for these kinds of programs where it's based on reciprocity, they may or may not qualify. You'd have to know what the tuition rate is that they have to pay. Good Neighbor Scholarship, I've mentioned it a couple of times. It is for students from countries of the Western Hemisphere, and financial aid officers and the international student officers at the campuses nominate people for this waiver. It actually has them pay no tuition. And I talked to our legal counsel and I said, they're getting even below the resident rate. Doesn't that mean that they don't have to mess about this? And he said, no, they are not paying the resident rate. By the letter of the law, the statute would apply to them. And then there's some other programs that just allow them to lower it, but not necessarily all the way. If they go all the way down to resident rate, then they get around the Senate Bill 1210 requirements. Now, aren't I making you feel good if you don't have to administer exemptions and waivers? Just think, your life could be a lot more complicated. However, just think how you might be able to help the people who are trying to do this. Okay, any questions about these programs? Or this program, this statute? Yes, ma'am.
This is kind of off the track, Jane, but sometimes we have students that arrive at the campus and they believe they qualify, but they don't know how to really go about the process of checking back. Is there any advice that we could give them at the college level?
Did everyone hear the question? What do you advise students who come in and think they might qualify for an exemption or waiver? Probably the first thing that really you need to know is who on campus does this. It may be your business office, bursar's office, admissions, registrar, financial aid in some cases. So somewhere on the campus there's someone responsible for this.
Like they show high school, and then we could put advice on where to go pre-college. Like I had one that was in foster care, but they were not able to get, I guess, with the high school counselor or whomever to make sure that they had the letter or they got whatever they need. That's what I'm saying. Is this something that we can do for them?
Okay. As I mentioned before, excuse me. Each program has a different set of eligibility requirements. In the case of foster care, what they're looking for is a document from the Department of Family Protective Services that confirms that the student was under their conservatorship at some point where it's relevant for the exemption. Whoever is assigned responsibility for these programs on your campus will be looking at the statutes and identifying that kind of necessary documentation. There isn't a lot that the student can do prior to coming into college other than to make sure they know what their options are. Okay, we have a website at the coordinating board that lists all these programs and has a fact sheet from all of them on the College for All Texans website. If you send them, let's say you're doing a high school night, and you have parents and you think they may need to know about these programs, you could give them that website and say, read these requirements, and if you think you meet those requirements, contact whatever college office does it at your school. Do you know who does it? Okay. Am I answering your question? I feel like I'm not. Okay, no, go ahead.
No, we have some that come, they're having problems getting in contact with high school counselors that may certify them or getting them in the vein before they even get to them.
Okay, well.
You know, like I was in foster care. Now, we went to one high school workshop, and the high school counselors are writing letters for this group of particular students to carry with them so that they have an official that's certifying that, yes, while they were in school, this is a different case, but they were unaccompanied minor, or they knew that they...
Okay. Well, in general, for these programs, what happened in high school is not relevant. And most, there isn't much a high school counselor can do on behalf of these students. It is a matter of the student proving to the institution that he or she meets the requirements that are in statute. And now there's a letter for the blind and deaf that indicates someone was, in good standing and that kind of deal a recommendation from the high school. As far as I know, that's the only program where the high school is pulled into it. Most of the time, it's between the student and the institution. Any other questions about the programs? Yes, sir.
Jane, is there anywhere or a cheat sheet or something of that nature to determine which of the exemptions waive statutory designated tuition? I find myself in an argument, it seems like every year, with the business office on, besides wading through Chapter 54, is there something out there?
Well, the Jane Caldwell interpretation of it, which with $1.50 might get you a cup of coffee, is that if it waives tuition, it waives tuition. And it doesn't specify statutory designated board authorized tuition is waived. So I would, if I had to give the answer, I would say I think all tuition is impacted. And the bottom line is that your institution, legal counsel probably needs to answer that question for your institution.
We do have some very old emails that get brought up from coordinating board staff that says, no, it's just waiving statutory, not designated. And I kind of disagree. I'm with you. I agree with your interpretation of it, but I don't know.
Do you know what program, or is this just kind of general across the board?
We come up a lot with the a lot of times on waivers as well, on what we're actually waiving to, but it comes up from time to time. I see it a lot, not necessarily, I said exemptions, but with waivers too, that there's a different value placed on like a competitive scholarship waiver versus the GATA waiver, and so we have a lot of internal conflicts. Two different offices administer those two waivers, and a student will say, well, I got this competitive scholarship, I also have the TARA waiver. I want the competitive scholarship waiver because it's waiving more than the RATA waiver, but will we have a limit on the amount of competitive scholarship waivers that we have? So it seems that we always get kind of in this issue.
Again, as I mentioned before, there are some programs. If you look at this list, in the far right column, it says CB rules, and it actually indicates whether we have rules on the program, and you'll see there are far more that we don't have rules for than we do. But for those that we have rules for, we might be able to give you a little more guidance. One of the things that it's easy for us to get drawn into trying to answer all your questions, but we can overstep really our authority in that. The really old emails, I would be interested if you have a copy of one of them, if you would scan it and send it to me. We can pursue whether we would still support that position or not, and it's rather amazing how long some people hang on to those kinds of things when we've long forgotten that they were ever issued. So,
especially your business office.
yeah, yeah. Let's see, is there anything else I need to point out to you? Again, attached to this, your table, is a copy of Senate Bill 1210. And we've talked about 1210 except for the last paragraph. We talked about it vaguely, and that's on page 3 of that document. And it's section 542002. And it very clearly states about if the course is not generating formula funding, there can't be exemptions and waivers for it. So that's the plain language ruling of that. It has been in rule, it's been in statute for a long time, but written in a way that no one quite figured out what it was saying. So that's a good improvement there. Any questions? I would recommend going to that website and at least generating a list of these programs. And for the people who go out and talk to the students, at your outreach folk, try to help students become aware of it, because it really is a terrible thing when they don't take advantage of one of these. Most of these programs were created as benefits for people whose parents were injured in the line of duty, or who are in some unusual situation like being blind or deaf, or from foster care and so forth. So there are reasons for these programs to exist, and we don't have an easy way to get the information out to them. One thing that has been discussed and we still haven't done is having each institution tell us who the contact is on their campus for these programs. Not with the idea that we would tell people, if you have any questions about any of these programs, go call so-and-so, but to say so-and-so is your starting point on the campus. And that lets them, that person then can say, oh, for veterans, you want to go to the Veterans Affairs Office. For this, you go talk to so-and-so. But we honestly have no idea whom to refer students to when we get those calls. So what do? Financial aid. So if it's not financial aid on your campus, it would help you for us to start giving these other people's names out. So is it, if we sent someone to you, you would at least know where to send them on your campus in general, right? Okay.
Jane.
So, yes, ma'am. Can you turn on your...
On that note, it would be good if we could find out, because sometimes when I'm having to prepare a letter for a student who's receiving the exemption for disabled, for peace officers, for the children of disabled and killed in the line of duty peace officers, we have no way of knowing who the contact person is to get that letter to them.
Very good.
And so we're having to mail it to the school, and normally I will put, the bursar's office or the registrar's office, because I have found that in working with some of the schools, that's where it needs to go.
Right.
But even at that, I have no way of knowing or being able to check back, did you receive this letter on behalf of this student?
Very good. So it is very likely that we will send out an email to all financial aid officers asking them to identify the contact to give out for their campuses. In fact, one of the things we've talked about is putting that list on our website where you go to find the information about these programs, so that someone would know whom to contact. It is, as I said before, $600 million a year is what's involved in these programs. And so they're significant, and we want to make sure that people learn about them. Any other questions?
I'd like to clarify something, because I heard something that may have been misleading as far as Top 10 is concerned. There are hardship provisions for Top 10. It's just not for initial students coming into the program. It's for renewal students with the GPA requirements or an extension of the 4-year limitation. They can't get more than 4 awards, but you could do an extension that it's not within 4 years and the GPA requirements. You just cannot do an extension for receiving the first award the fall semester immediately following graduation, or for full-time enrollment. Does that make sense? So I just want to make sure y'all understood that, because I don't want you to think that there are not hardship provisions for the Top 10.
Thank you, Lynn. Again, on this table that you have, the first column is M or O, Mandatory or optional is what that stands for. You'll notice, for instance, combat exemption has an O with an asterisk. You can make that exemption. We just want to make sure you understand you're not going to be reimbursed. And that's true for all of these programs. There are no reimbursements for these programs at this point in time. Who is administering the Hazelwood Act now? Texas Veterans Commission, not the coordinating board. Okay, the second row is E or W, exemption or waiver. Then you have the names of the programs, the current statutes. Now, these statutes, a lot of them were changed a couple of years ago, but this is the current statute. And then that next column is our attempt to give you some guidance about Senate Bill 1210, and then the last one is whether we do have rules. And at the bottom of the list, there are some websites that you may go to how to get some additional information about the programs. Thank you very much.
We'll break for lunch and we will return and begin again at 1 o'clock. So you have about an hour and 15 minutes to get a bite to eat, and we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.
Welcome back. Hope you had a nice lunch. Just one quick announcement for our online viewers. The email address to send in questions is FAmeeting with no S at the end. Just FAmeeting at thecb.state.tx.us. Okay, so as long as you take out the S, we'll be able to receive your correspondence. I'm going to make a brief presentation on some security enhancements that we're going to be going through here at the coordinating board. This is to improve security privacy protocols on web-based applications, and it is going to be affecting financial aid web-based programs such as Texas Grant, TEOG, and TEG. These web-based programs that will be affected will be the award history screen and also your fund request. Currently, the way that you log in to make your fund request is going to be changing. We are now going to ask for everyone to have an individualized password and ID. We will work, this new security process will require us to work with a staff liaison at your institution who will basically be like the institutional master, making sure that only appropriate personnel have access to the applications, and also if personnel leaves, that they deactivate their access to those applications. This is probably very familiar to you all. This is very similar security protocol for financial aid applications, such as federal financial aid applications, so it's not anything new. It'll just be new for the coordinating board. The liaison, whomever that person may be, we did talk to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee and spoke with financial aid directors. We wanted to go ahead and assume that they will be the financial aid liaison for us, the directors will be, and they quickly said it's likely that they will not be. So, so it's more likely that it'll be staff that'll act as our liaison and be the coordinator for passwords and IDs at your institutions. And I just wanted to let you know this is a heads up. This will go into place before September 1st. So this is up and coming. And you will receive some notifications shortly with a manual and instructions. It's not a difficult process. It's not rocket science. It's logging in, creating an ID, creating a password, and giving some authority to other users. So it'll look very familiar as other applications do. Does anybody have any questions regarding this? Dun, dun, dun. No questions? Okay. Well, we hope to we'll probably have an online webinar just to help people guide through, and again, a manual that will be sent out to explain the process, the new security protocol once it all rolls out, and it'll probably be rolling out in about a month or two. Thanks, guys. Next upcoming is our audit and desk review presentation.
Good afternoon. That's better. My name is Mark Pale, and I am Director of Internal Audit and Compliance here at the Coordinating Board. And I would like to present to you this afternoon just a short presentation on our compliance monitoring function, because undoubtedly we will be visiting your institutions at some point in the future if we have not already scheduled or performed a review of financial aid or formula funding at your institution. So we just wanted to kind of go over who we are, what we're about, and our review approach, and kind of what you can expect to see whenever we conduct a compliance monitoring review. David Mahoney is with me. David's going to be actually getting into some of the nuts and bolts of our process here in a minute, and I thought I would start off just by giving you an overview of our function and kind of how we came into existence. So I began here at this agency in 2012 when we were just coming out of the Sunset review process, and the Sunset Commission actually had a recommendation that this agency needed to establish a formalized compliance monitoring function. And the Sunset Commission recommended really two main areas or subject matter areas that we would focus our compliance monitoring. One of them being financial aid, grants, funds that flow through the coordinating board to the institutions across the state. And then the other area being the information, the data that is reported to the coordinating board that's used for primarily for formula funding purposes. So those are the two types of reviews that Sunset wanted to see more formalized, and ultimately the Sunset report, we went through a negotiated rule-making process, and so we actually came out of that process in the legislative session with Texas Administrative Code, Title 19, Part 1, Chapter 1, and this is Rule 1.13, and it's internal audit and compliance monitoring. And so the negotiated rulemaking process gave us the, I guess really the structure of our compliance monitoring process, and it included input from all the members of the that committee, which was very broad-based. We had membership of large public institutions, privates, community colleges, pretty much a full array of types of institutions where we talked about compliance monitoring in these two areas, and the committee unanimously adopted the rules that we follow. So if your institution is selected, or when your institution is selected for a compliance monitoring visit, certainly you can see the rules that we follow if you reference that particular Texas Administrative Code rule that governs our function. The legislature appropriated the funds for 4 positions that report to me. I actually am director over the internal audit side of our operation, focused internally on our operations within the coordinating board, as well as this compliance monitoring function, which is completely externally focused. I think that having both functions reporting to a single individual is beneficial to everyone involved, because as I've heard from some of the discussions earlier today, there's a lot of interaction and interface between the institutions in terms of the types of guidance that's needed, problems that you're having, and so forth. So our internal audit group can also we can take information that we get where we're informed through our compliance monitoring process, and we can feed that into our internal audit side to work with the program areas and try to kind of have a holistic approach that results in better processes. So that is the goal. This really just kind of captures the two-pronged approach, our two areas of focus that we have on formula funding information and financial aid. And financial aid, if you look in the statute, it's very broadly defined. So we can look at anything really in terms of state funds that would range from grants to loans to really any type of aid that's flowing from this agency to institutions of higher education. The statute also talks about different methodologies that are employed, and David's going to get into this here in a minute. But the two types of methodologies that are mentioned by statute are site visits and desk reviews. So we've been conducting site visits predominantly, but we've recently started adding to our process the desk review approach. And David will talk to you about some of the differences in the approach and what that might mean in terms of what you would be seeing from us. So that's the very high-level overview, and at this point, I'll ask David to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm David Mahoney. I am a compliance specialist with the coordinating board. I am one of the 4 people that will be showing up at your institution to conduct an audit, or either a site visit, as was mentioned, or a desk review. I'll go over first the process for the site visit. It is more formalized right now. As Mark mentioned, we are still in the process of piloting the desk review process, so we are still working on that, and it has a ways to go, but I will give you as much information on that process as I can. But first, let's talk about the site visit that we do. Every year, beginning in around May, we start doing a risk assessment of all of the universities throughout the state of Texas and to ultimately prepare our audit plan for the coming year. We are in that process right now for FY15. And when we do that risk assessment, we take in several factors, or have to look at several factors. The TAC 1.13 actually has 7 factors that we have to consider in our risk assessment, and you see them listed there in slide number 1, which I don't, or item number 1. But anyway, I'll go over them for you. We have to consider the amount of student financial assistance or grant funds. We have to consider whether the institution is required to obtain and submit an independent audit. We have to consider the institution's internal controls. We have to consider the length of time since the institution's last desk review or site visit. We have to consider any past misuse of funds or misreported data by the institution. We have to consider whether any data reported by the board is used for determining funding allocations, and then any other factors as we deem necessary. When we do our risk assessment, 2 of the factors that are weighted more heavily than all of the others are the amount of student financial assistance and the length of time since the last institution's desk review or site visit by the coordinating board. And so those 2 factors are weighted more heavily. So once we get the risk assessment done that determines which institutions that we are going to go to in the coming year, the chief executive officer of the institution is notified early in that year that we will be coming to do either a site visit or a desk review. That's usually sometime in September or October. They are notified at that time. That is just a general notification that we're coming. The individual auditor will later contact the institution, the contact person at that institution, and to set up the actual date of the audit. So although the CEO may be contacted in September, I may be calling the contact person at the institution saying, I'm going to be coming to do the desk review in August. So it can be any length of time after that. We just try to get any preliminary information that we can from the contact person at that point. The next phase of the site visit that we go to then is the notification and planning. Like I said, once the institutions have been selected, I will get the contact person information from the program area. I will ask them, well, who do I need to contact at such and such institution regarding financial aid, and they will give me a name, and that is the person that I will make initial contact with. Now, it may not be the person that ultimately the institution wants me to deal with, but this will be my initial point of contact that I'll call up and say, my name is David Mahoney. I'm with the coordinating board. I'm calling to set up a site visit at your institution or a desk review at your institution, and then I will give a range of dates that I would like to be there. And we try to work with institutions in setting up these site visits or desk reviews. So, it may be that you have something going on, you can't have it that week. We will try to work with you on when we can get in to do the site visit. Once we've got the notification done, then I start working on the planning phase of the site visit or the audit. And in that planning phase, I'm gathering as much preliminary information as I can about the institution, about the applicable rules. I will read whatever tax are applicable to whatever type of financial aid that I might be auditing. In other words, if I'm going to audit a Texas grant, I'll be looking at any applicable tax or other state regulations that are applicable to that Texas grant. I'll be going to the institution's website to gather whatever information that I can from the institution's website relating to the Texas grant and their policies and procedures related to that. We're getting all kinds of input from the program areas, so as to what kinds of programs that we will be looking at, it just depends, again, on our risk assessment. So we may be coming to your institution to look at the Texas grant, the TEG, the Be On Time, CAL, or there may be a small program that's never been looked at that we would be asked by program to look at. So anything and everything, like Mark said, that is on the table as far as coming to look and audit. It's during this early planning phase that we send out our sample request to the institution. We will pull a statistically valid random sample from the financial data that we have received, and we will send that sample information to the institution at this point. I have had some institutions that once we get on site, they have already pulled those samples for us and had the documentation ready. We've gone to other institutions where they have just given us access to their Banner system or their PeopleSoft system, and I just go into there and I pull the screens up and look at the information from there. That is strictly up to the institution as to how they want us to handle that. You can either give us that kind of access or you can have the information pulled for us when we get there. We usually send out the information, or we do send out the information, the sample request, and ask that any responses that we get from the institution be sent by secured, encrypted email. We use two types of encryption. We use a system called DataMotion that we use. We've had some institutions whose systems blocked DataMotion. So we have another method that we use also for institutions that we have a lot of information that we're going to send, and it's called the Move It portal. And we have a process where I get the contact information from the person that I'm going to be dealing with. I send that to our IT department. They set up a Move It portal for that person, and then they will contact that person and say, here is where you send the information, and it goes to our system, and I can pull it right off of our that Move It portal and put it into the file that I need to here. So those are two ways that we can do the encrypted data back and forth. So once I've got all of the planning phase done of the audit, then we go and have the site visit, and the first thing that I do, the auditors do, is hold an entrance conference. Usually it's on the first day. Sometimes due to circumstances it might not be on the first day, but usually it's on that first day, and we meet with whomever the institution wants us to meet with. I've had as few as 3 and as many as 25 people in the entrance conference. The 25 was a little bit intimidating when I'm sitting there by myself and they've got 25 people in the room, but it's up to the institution who they want to invite to the entrance conference. There are 2 people that we normally specifically request to be in the entrance conference, and that is if the institution has an internal audit shop, we always like to have the internal audit person or a representative from the internal audit shop there at the entrance conference, and we would always like to have somebody from the IT side there, because part of our process is, since we are looking at financial data and enrollment data, we have to have some assurance of the integrity and the controls that are around that data. And so we like to meet with the IT department to ensure that we can rely on that IT. Part of the process requires us to do that. If you saw on one of the slides, our audits are all done in accordance with government auditing standards, or what's known as the Yellow Book. And that Yellow Book requires that as an auditor I gain some assurance of the controls around the IT data. So we like to have the IT involved in the entrance conference too, in case there are any questions that we have regarding information. That information. And it's an opportunity for the institution, you as an institution, to ask us any questions about the process. And I've had some institutions where I've given them this very similar breakdown of this is what we're doing, and they can ask any other questions that they might, or concerns they might have. I go over the scope of the audit, what I'm going to be looking at. Financial aid, I would say I'm here to do an audit of the Texas grant, and I'm going to be looking at eligibility. I'm going to be testing eligibility for this grant. And then I would say I'm looking at spring of so-and-so through fall of so-and-so. So I give you the scope and that I'm going to be looking at the audit and the entrance conference. And once we have that entrance conference, it usually lasts we schedule it for about 30 minutes, a very short meeting. Try not to make it a very long one. We proceed then to our field work. By this time, you as an institution have the samples that we've sent and have either pulled them or are going to give the auditor direct access into your system to look at the items on the sample. And it is during this process that we will review whatever documentation we might do. We might do some interviews with staff, and then we'll test whatever source documentation that we're pulling from. And we have this time already established, have a test worksheet that has the attributes that we're going to test while we're there. We have in our audit shop an electronic audit work program called Teammate, and we have already set up within that program the test worksheet that we're going to do. So like if I'm doing a financial aid audit, I might have an attribute column there for my sample that I will test residency, or I might test I'll test residency, and I'll test selective service, and I'll test SAP, different attributes that are applicable to that grant. And we determined that the information that you have provided to us here at the coordinating board is accurate, valid, and Then we will determine whether or not there are the controls that you have over that data are in place and are operating as they should be. Then, once the field work is done, we have what we call a preliminary issues meeting. I will say that also during the field work phase, our auditors usually have a daily meeting with the contact person every day to go over any issues that may have arisen that day, so that when we get to the preliminary issues meeting, there are no surprises, hopefully, at that point. Hopefully every day that I meet with the contact person, if there are any issues, I can get those out there to them and they can get the responses back to me, and that issue is addressed before we ever get to the final preliminary issues meeting. But in that preliminary issues meeting, we're going to go over any unresolved items that might have arisen during the field work. Again, whoever the institution wants to have at that meeting, they can bring to the meeting. We will go over whatever I've found. They can share whatever their concerns are with what I've found or what the auditor has found. And then I explain to them that anything that, even if it's no issues, if I find nothing, everything I do is reviewed by Mark and by program, and they review everything that I do. So even if I think it might be an issue, once I get back here, program looks at it and they say, well, that's really not an issue. And so we do vet everything before that final report. Once we have the audit findings or no findings done, we will draft the audit report at this point. That draft report is usually going to go out to the institution anywhere from 30 to 45 days after the field work is completed. That's our goal. It will include any observations, whether it be we didn't find anything or this is what we found at that point. Again, that draft report is vetted here at the coordinating board, and then we will send a copy of that draft report out to the institution for their review prior to issuing a more formal report. Once you've seen that draft report, if there are issues, we hold a formal exit. Now, that exit conference, again, can be in person or it might be over the phone, depending upon the circumstances. And at that, we go over every issue that's in the report with you, and this is your chance to comment on any of those issues, put any input that you have. And then we indicate to you that the formal report will go out to the Chief Executive Officer of the institution. And then you can voice any concerns at this point. If there are issues, we will require a response or a plan of correction from the institution. And in that plan of correction, usually we would like to see what you're going to do, who is going to be responsible for doing it, and when you're going to implement it. So there's kind of three things that we would like to see in that plan of correction or that response. What you're going to do about it, who's going to be responsible for it, and when is it going to be implemented. If there are no issues, normally we consider the vetting of the draft report to be the exit conference. I haven't had an auditee yet that's called back and said, no, we don't like the fact that you didn't find anything, and can you please come back out and look at us again? But if they ever did, we would certainly consider that. The final report is then distributed, as you can see there, to all of those people listed there. And it's also distributed to our board, the agency oversight committee here at the coordinating board, and then to all of the state oversight people. If there are issues that require us to have audit follow-up, we will do audit follow-up based upon the issues to verify that the recommendations and the corrective actions that y'all have indicated that y'all will perform have been done. It will just depend upon the circumstances of the audit. And so that's the process for the site visits. As you can see, our desk review process is in place. The desk review is slightly different than a site visit. The site visits are done in accordance with the Yellow Book. A site visit or a desk review is considered a non-audit service, and so we don't have to follow all the chapters of the Yellow Book for it. So we have a lot of leeway in as far as what we can do in a desk review that we don't have in a site visit. Site visits are they're audits, and they're very prescriptive in sample sizes and procedures that we have to do. A desk review is a lot different, and it gives us a lot more leeway in that. So normally the desk reviews are going to be a lot smaller in sample size than a site visit. The notification process and the planning process are still fairly similar to a site visit, but the actual work, the size of the work and the scope of the work is going to be smaller. The big difference in the desk review and the site visit is that I do not come to your facility. We do not come to your facility. I'll send the contact person the sample and say, pull the source documentation for this sample, send it to me, and I'll look at it, and if I have any further questions, I'll contact him. But it's all done by email or over the phone. We do not come to the facility. And so that's normally, that's kind of the steps of the audit and our site visit and desk review process. You have any questions? Oh, I did a good job. No questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, while we're changing to let our loan operations folk come on up to do a presentation, I do have a question, Sophia, for you for your CBID presentation. She wants to know, how will you determine who will receive the new manuals and instructions on these new procedures? Are you going to use those that have current CB access? Question mark? Oh. How will you determine who will receive the new manuals and instructions for these new procedures on CBID? Are you going to use those that have current CB access? Question mark.
No, we are not going to use those who currently have CBID access. We're not limiting it to that. There are some staff that may have CBID access, and we're going to contact you. But if you're not the contact liaison or the person that's currently working with Texas Grant or TOG or TEG, then that determination of whether you'll be an authorized user for those application will be made with the liaison at your institution. So just because you have CBID access doesn't mean you'll have access to Texas Grant, TOG, or TEG. Does that answer the question?
She'll email me back if it doesn't.
Find out. Okay.
Any other questions before we start the loan program operations presentation? Okay.
Hello, everybody. How you doing? And then there was one final one. That's me. Want to say, put a shout out to the people online. I'm sure they're watching. A lot of our people do watch online. And a special shout out to my son who's on vacation. I do work when I leave home, so this is verification. I work, son, okay? I wanted to just kind of introduce our department. We have a small department. There's 4 loan reps and a program manager. Albert Contreras over there is our program manager. I'm sure many of you have dealt with him previously. We also have our newbie, Valerie Chacon. She's the loan representative, Amanda Rivera, and Young-hee Lambert is there. And I'm Davin Burt, loan representative here. I've been here for 8 years now, so I may have dealt with or assisted some of you here. Today, I'm going to go over our loan programs. There's been a lot of changes in our program, so I'll go over that as well as some other information. So, let's see. We'll start out with the Be On Time loan and go over some program highlights as well as eligibility requirements, and then annual loan amounts for FY15. And then we'll hit the legislative updates, which affect you all as well as you all primarily. Then we'll hit the college access loan, go through eligibility requirements, program highlights, our new credit guidelines, which are a great new thing, and our origination fee changes. So we'll hit all those areas throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions or anything, feel free, shout it out or raise your hand. I'll point out to you, and we'll deal with those accordingly. Okay, so for the Be On Time loan, for those of you that may not be familiar with it, it's a no-interest loan that goes to eligible Texas students. If specific goals are met, then that loan can actually be forgiven at the end of the student's time, their graduation. There's a 6-month grace period if they do end up having to repay the loan, and a 15-month repayment period on that as well. Now, applicants must complete a FAFSA and be eligible for federal financial aid. So, if they're not able to do that, then they would not be eligible. They must be enrolled full-time in an undergraduate degree program as well, be a Texas resident or entitled to pay resident tuition as a dependent child of a member of U.S. Armed Services. They must graduate in or after the 02-03 academic year from a high school in Texas under the recommended high school program or its equivalent. Now, that or its equivalent can also include students that were homeschooled, as long as their curriculum met the recommended curriculum for high school students on their graduation. So that's something that's thrown in there, and we get those questions once in a while. But just to put it out there, yes, homeschool students can receive Be On Time loan. And also, either they must have earned an associate's degree from an eligible institution no earlier than May 1st of 2005. This one. I'll go with this one. Okay. So renewal eligibility for students who've received it and they want to continue receiving it after the first year, they must just maintain the SAP requirements that you all provide to them. After that first year, they must complete at least 75% of their semester credit hours that they attempt in the most recent academic year, maintain a 2.5 GPA for the coursework they attempted. Now, a student cannot receive the Be On Time for more than 150 credit hours. So they can receive it for 150, but anything after that, they would not be able or eligible to receive it. Okay. Now, there are a few eligibility exceptions. Currently, this is a new thing. Students can now receive the Texas Grant and the Texas Beyond Time Loan in the same academic period. Previously, they were not able to do that. The two programs were kind of in conjunction with one another. If the student was eligible for the grant, then they wouldn't get Beyond Time. If they weren't eligible for the grant, then they would. Now they can get both at the same time. So that's a big change that's happened. Now, there are some hardship situations, cases where students can receive a prorated Beyond Time loan. Those are in case of illness, or if they're caring for a sick person or sick family member, or if they only need less than 9 units to graduate, then they can still receive that Beyond Time loan as well. And the proration pretty much goes along the same lines, I think, as the Texas Grant I saw earlier. So it's kind of the same guidelines. Now, for this coming academic year, for four-year public students, they can receive $4,000 a semester and $8,000 for the total year. So that amount has gone up. So it's a very good award for the students. Also, there's origination fee of 3% on each disbursement. So that is taken out before it reaches the campuses. Any questions or anything to this point? Okay. I skipped one. Okay. There we go. So in the most recent legislative session, there were some changes to the Beyond Time loan. There were changes to the allocation, how we allocate those funds, as well as sweeping funds, which we've never done before, so we'll start doing, as well as reallocation of those funds. And then the big one, required loan repayment and default prevention counseling. So I'll go over those. Now, for allocation of funds, we now have a formula, specific formula that we will be using each year. Previously, it's kind of been, the biggest users, we try to get them a larger chunk of the funds. But now there's an actual formula by which we'll be using to give those funds out to the schools. Schools, public institutions receive calculated in proportion to the amount of tuition set aside by that institution for the preceding academic year, and those funds will be based on authorized funding. So in this example, we have, say, there's a total of $60 million set asides from all schools, but the legislature authorizes $45 million to be authorized to be given. So the proportionate share that the school will receive would be 75% in this scenario. So depending on what the authorization for use is for that year, that would be the percentage, that would determine the percentage of set-asides you'll receive back for the Beyond Time loan. Any questions? Okay. Sweeping of funds, beginning in February 2015 on the 20th. Any funds that are not encumbered or used by that date, we will be sweeping them. So, you definitely want to be sure that you try to encumber those funds, certify those loans prior to that date if you do have students that are eligible or in need. Now, reallocation. Once we sweep those funds, then we'll be reallocating those funds out to institutions that will be using those funds, or that process is still being developed, to my knowledge. And so once that is finalized, we'll be letting everyone know how we'll plan on doing that. But definitely stay tuned or contact Albert Contreras in regards to that if you're expecting, you want more funds for that year. And also, if we need to, sweep additional funds after that and reallocate again, we will do that as well. Okay. Now, required loan repayment and default prevention counseling. This is result of the legislative session. And I think the method that they've come up with is for default, they'll use a 3-year cohort of loan default rate. And if your default rate is greater than the statewide average, you will be required to provide counseling to your students that will be receiving the award. So that will be a requirement. As far as forgiveness is concerned, it's once again a 3-year cohort forgiveness rate, and if it's lower than 50% of the statewide average, you'll be required to provide counseling to your students in regards to forgiveness. Now, currently, we are collaborating with TG to develop materials that can be provided and used for those counseling sessions. So more information will be coming on that as it goes online and is available. Jeff? The statewide average, I think they determined those numbers recently, Albert?
Coming out of the last Financial Aid Advisory Committee, and that was a couple of weeks ago, the recommendation from the committee was to go with the 3-year cohort for both forgiveness and default. I think another recommendation was obviously to have a starting point, and I believe we'll probably come out September the 1st with cohort years effective at the end of the 14 year. So we won't publish those. We do have some preliminaries that are as of May, a month ago, and if you let me know, I'll be glad to share that with you. Again, that's a different kind of cohort year that we have using May versus what you may see come September 1st. Did that help you? Okay.
Deb, and I also have an online question. This person wants to know, when is the new allocation of funds being implemented?
Allocation, well, the current allocation that's out there is based on the new requirements, the new guidelines. So for the FY 2015 year, that allocation is based on these new guidelines. And I think there's a handout as well on those allocations for BOT and CAL in your information. Okay, we'll move on to the College Access Loan. As many of you know, you're familiar with the College Access Loan. Students do not have to demonstrate financial need. Can be used to cover all or part of the student's EFC. Federal aid cannot be covered by a Cal loan. That federal eligibility would have to be considered before certifying a college access loan. Now, students must be a Texas resident, enrolled in at least half-time, course study leading to a degree, some sort of degree, associate's, bachelor's, or graduate. Meet SAP guidelines as well on that. And receive a favorable credit evaluation or provide a cosigner that does. Now, for the 14-15 academic year, interest rate is the same, 5.25% fixed. Cosigners must be at least 21 and have a regular source of income. Nothing has changed there. Cannot be a spouse. That's one thing we can't stress enough. We get a lot of spouses trying to cosign. It's like, sorry, you cannot be a spouse and cosign. Of course, they must have a favorable credit evaluation and be a citizen or permanent resident of the United States. Repayment, there's a 6-month grace period after the student leaves school or graduates. Principal balances under $30,000 would have a 10-year repayment period. Principal balances over 30, that bumps up to about 20 years, up to 20 years, depending on a student's situation. So the big changes to the Cal loan. Now, in previous years, in order to be approved for a college access loan, either the student or cosigner had to have a Vantage score of 700 or higher. Well, that's changed completely now, and as long as they have a Vantage score of 591 or higher, they will be approved for a college access loan. So it's definitely expanding the group of students that can receive the college access loan. Now, with that, we've moved our origination fee structure away from having a borrower or cosigner or the borrower and cosigner be approved. In the past, if one of the two were approved, it'd be 5%, or if both, it would be 3%. So now with the tiered program, it's going to be based on the actual Vantage score that the student receives, what origination fee they would receive. So for a score of 711 or greater, there would be no origination fee, 0% origination fee. If the score is between 651 and 710, it would be a 3% origination fee. And then greater than 590, it's a 5%. Well, 590 to 650, it's a 5% origination fee. And then below 590, they're not approved. So hopefully that definitely will expand, the students that are eligible to receive that award.
Davin, I've had this question quite a bit. Institutions have asked why we use Vantage Score as opposed to the other credit bureaus. I guess that's what they're called.
Okay, yeah. I'll defer to Albert on that one. I'm not sure.
Why Vantage Score versus...
Why Vantage? Yeah, they say the others seem to be more common and easier or something. I don't know.
Well, Vantage Score, much like what we all see on TV as FICO, are predictors. They're predictors of an individual based on algorithms of an individual's expectation to repay. The algorithms vary a little bit between companies, if you will. Vantage Score is a flavor. FICO is a flavor of predictors. The difference is pricing. FICO is a little more expensive, where Vantage Score yields basically the same results for our purposes and is much more reasonable as far as the price. And if we can drop the price on that, keep our interest rates at 5.25%, then the students are the ones that take advantage or get the advantage of that.
Well, the final piece is our state loan programs. We do an annual mass email to previous recipients of the CAL, the BOT, and the TASF loans, and we should be doing that later this month. Just want to let you all know. Now, in those emails, we do encourage the students to contact their financial aid office to request, those BOTs, CALs, and TASF loans. So just know that you may be getting an uptick in those calls from students in regards to those programs. Well, is there any questions about anything at this point? Okay, well, that's my presentation. Thank you.
Anybody have any other questions about anything we've gone over today? Okay, well, I would like to remind you to complete your evaluation. And for those of you that are here on site, you can just leave it on your table when you leave and we'll pick that up. For those of you that are online, as I said, the evaluation forms, if you were to go to the GNSP information site, the evaluation form is attached to the agenda. And if you can complete it, and then you can attach it to an email to fameneting@thecb.state.tx.us. Okay. Okay, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it, and we enjoyed visiting with you today.
And have a safe trip home.
Yes, have a safe trip home.